There is a moment that happens every day, and almost no one notices it. Your brain is still awake, your body is still breathing, but the voice in your head is gone. Not quieter, not calmer, gone. No narration, no commentary, no "I should," no "what if," no replay of the day. Just a brief, fragile gap where the brain stops talking. That moment is not an accident. It is not a glitch. It is not emptiness. It is one of the most precise states the human brain can enter. And tonight, whether you remember it or not, you will pass through it again. Before we go any further, let me say this clearly. If you are listening to this recording right now, and if you want more of these long-form night explorations into sleep, the brain, and the quiet places inside the mind, take a moment to like this recording, share it with someone who listens at night, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings, not because it helps an algorithm, but because this kind of content only survives when people choose to keep it alive. Now, stay with me, because what we are about to talk about is not something you can understand in the usual way. You can only recognize it by remembering how it feels. Think about the last time you almost fell asleep, not fully asleep, not dreaming. That strange edge where thoughts stop forming sentences. A thought begins and then collapses halfway through. Words lose their grammar. Images lose their meaning. You are still aware, but you're no longer thinking about anything. That is the threshold, and the brain behaves very differently there. During the day, your mind feels like a narrator that never shuts up. It explains, judges, predicts, replays, rehearses. Even when you are quiet, there is still a voice describing the quiet. But right before sleep, something changes. The narrator steps away, not because you asked it to, not because you trained it. It steps away because the brain no longer needs it. This is where most people misunderstand mental silence. They imagine it as peace, or enlightenment, or a special meditative achievement. But mental silence is not something you reach. It is something that happens when the brain stops defending your identity for a moment. All day long, the brain works to maintain a story. Who you are, what you want, what just happened, what might happen next. That story requires constant language. Inner speech is not a side effect of consciousness. It is a tool, a very expensive one. So expensive, in fact, that the brain cannot afford to run it forever. As night approaches, energy priorities shift. The systems that keep the story going begin to loosen their grip. Not suddenly, gradually. And the first thing to go is narration. This is why you cannot force silence. If you sit down during the day and say, "I will stop thinking now," the voice immediately responds. Trying to silence thought is still thought doing its job. But near sleep, the brain does something different. It doesn't suppress the voice. It simply stops generating it, like a radio that loses its signal. And when that happens, many people feel something strange, a soft disorientation. As if the sense of me becomes thinner, less solid. Some describe it as floating, others as falling. Some feel comfort, others feel a flash of fear, because for a brief moment, you exist without explanation. No labels, no memories actively playing, no future plans pulling you forward, just presence without commentary. This is not unconsciousness. This is not sleep yet. This is awareness without language, and the brain enters it every night. You were there last night. You will be there again tonight. The question is not whether it happens. The question is why we forget it so completely. The answer lies in how memory works. Memory depends on narrative. To remember something, the brain needs a story hook. But in mental silence, there is no story being told, nothing to tag, nothing to label. So the moment passes without leaving a trace. You don't remember the silence. You remember falling asleep. You remember waking up. But the most interesting part, the bridge between the two, is usually erased, unless something interrupts it. A sudden noise, a hypnic jerk, a brief realization of, I'm falling asleep. And for just a second, you catch yourself right as the voice disappears. That is the moment this recording is pointing toward, not to hold it, not to chase it, just to notice that it exists. Because once you notice it, something subtle changes about how night feels. Sleep becomes less of a shutdown and more of a transition. Meditation becomes less of a struggle and more of a remembering. And silence stops feeling like absence. It starts feeling like a different mode of being. But we're moving too fast. Let's slow down. Right now, as you listen, your brain is still talking. It is processing these words, comparing them to your own experience, agreeing, disagreeing, drifting. That's fine. The goal is not to turn it off. The goal is to recognize that this talking state is not permanent. It only feels permanent because you spend most of your waking life inside it. Imagine if you lived next to a highway from the day you were born. After a while, the noise would feel normal. You wouldn't notice it anymore. Inner speech is like that, constant, familiar, invisible, until it stops. And suddenly you realize how loud it always was. In the next part of this recording, we're going to sit with that noise for a moment. Not to analyze it, not to fix it, just to observe how busy the waking mind really is, and why it works so hard to keep talking. Because only by understanding the noise can we appreciate what happens when the brain finally lets it fade. And as you stay here, listening, your own thoughts may begin to loosen. Not because of anything I say, but because night has its own logic, and the brain, sooner or later, always remembers how to be quiet. During the day, the noise inside your head feels natural, so natural that you rarely question it. Thoughts line up one after another, not as individual events, but as a continuous stream that seems to belong to you. Plans, worries, memories, judgments, imaginary conversations, they overlap. They interrupt each other. They restart when they fail to resolve. And yet, despite how crowded it feels, the brain experiences this constant activity as normal. Not because it is quiet, but because it is familiar. The waking mind is not actually calm. It is simply trained. From the moment you wake up, the brain switches into a mode that could be called narration. It begins to explain what is happening, what should happen next, what might go wrong, and how everything connects back to the idea of me. This narration is so fast that it rarely arrives as full sentences. Most of the time, it feels more like pressure, a subtle sense that something needs to be done, or remembered, or corrected. Even when nothing is happening, the mind fills the space, waiting in line, lying in bed. Staring out a window, the brain does not tolerate empty time easily. It reaches for something to say. This is where many people make a mistake. They assume that constant thinking is a sign of intelligence, or productivity, or awareness. But in reality, most of this mental noise has nothing to do with solving problems. It has to do with maintaining continuity. The brain wants to be certain that the person who went to sleep last night is the same person who woke up this morning. To do that, it needs a thread. Thoughts are that thread. Every memory recalled, every plan imagined, every inner comment about the present moment serves one purpose: to keep the story intact. This is why silence feels uncomfortable during the day. When thoughts slow down, the thread weakens, and the brain responds the way it always does when something threatens stability. It produces more noise. Have you noticed how your mind behaves the moment things become quiet? The instant a room grows still, your thoughts often get louder. When there is nothing to react to externally, the brain turns inward. It reviews the past. It projects the future. It invents scenarios, not because they are useful, but because they keep the system running. This is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism. For most of human history, being mentally idle was dangerous. Silence meant vulnerability. A brain that scanned constantly for patterns, threats, and opportunities had a better chance of keeping the body alive. So, the modern mind inherited an ancient habit. Stay alert. Stay narrating. Stay busy. Even when there is nothing left to monitor, the result is a kind of background hum, not loud enough to overwhelm you, but persistent enough to shape your experience of being awake. You do not notice it as sound. You notice it as tension, a slight tightness in the forehead, a restlessness in the chest, a feeling that the moment is incomplete. This is the noise we call consciousness. But it is not the only form consciousness can take. It is simply the one you spend the most time in. The talking brain is excellent at many things. It can plan years ahead. It can replay moments with painful precision. It can imagine futures that have never existed. But it is inefficient. Maintaining narration requires enormous energy. Language itself is metabolically expensive.
Every word you think activates networks across the brain, areas that manage memory, emotion, prediction, and control light up together. This is why sustained thinking feels tiring. Even when you're sitting still, your brain is working hard, and this effort is not evenly distributed across the day. It peaks when you are awake, alert, and socially engaged. The more you interact, the more the brain needs to explain who said what it meant, how you should respond. Social life, especially, amplifies narration. When you are alone, the mind still talks. But when you are around others, it narrates constantly, monitoring tone, reading expressions, adjusting identity. Who am I here? How am I being seen? All of that requires inner speech. By the time night arrives, the brain has been telling the story of you for many hours without pause. And like any system that runs continuously, it begins to show signs of fatigue. But fatigue does not arrive as silence, at least not at first. It arrives as repetition. You may notice the same thoughts looping, the same worries resurfacing without adding new information, the same memories replaying without resolution. This is not insight, it is exhaustion. The brain is still talking, but it is running out of variation. This is often mistaken for overthinking, but overthinking is not too much thinking, it is thinking that has lost its direction. The system keeps generating language because it has not yet received permission to stop. That permission does not come from willpower, it comes from context. Specifically, from the signals that night provides. As light fades, the brain begins to change how it allocates resources. Visual processing becomes less dominant. Motor planning slows. Attention softens. None of this happens instantly. It unfolds gradually, often without conscious awareness. The talking mind does not shut off right away.
Instead, it starts to lose clarity. Thoughts become less precise. You may begin a sentence in your head and forget how it was supposed to end. Images drift in without explanation. Memories surface that do not connect to anything. This is not distraction, it is transition. The brain is loosening its grip on narrative coherence. And this is where the experience of noise changes. During the day, mental noise feels sharp. At night, it becomes blurry. The voice is still there, but it is slurring. Words stretch. Ideas lose their edges. This is the first sign that the talking brain is reaching its limit. Some people resist this moment. They try to stay mentally sharp. They replay conversations. They check their phones. They force themselves to think clearly. This effort keeps narration alive longer, but it also increases the sense of strain. Because the brain is now being asked to do something it is preparing to stop doing. Others allow the blur. They let thoughts fragment. They stop correcting the stream. And when that happens, the noise does something unexpected. It thins, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to create small gaps, pauses between thoughts, moments where nothing replaces the last idea. These gaps are easy to miss. They are brief, fragile, often filled immediately by the next thought. But they matter because they are the precursors to silence. The talking brain does not stop mid-sentence. It fades like a crowd leaving a stadium. At first you hear voices everywhere, then fewer, then distant echoes, then only space. What makes this process confusing is that awareness does not disappear alongside narration. You are still here. You still know that you're lying in bed. You still hear sounds in the room. You still feel your body. But the commentary about these things weakens. Instead of, I hear a car passing, there is just sound. Instead of, my arm is heavy, there is just sensation. This is where people often say they feel like they are drifting, because without narration, experience loses its anchor points. There is no voice to say, this is happening to me. There is only happening. The brain has not shut down. It has changed modes. During the day, consciousness is language-driven. At night, it becomes sensory and diffuse. This shift is not unique to humans. Many animals operate almost entirely without inner narration. They respond, they feel, they act, but they do not appear to maintain a continuous verbal self-story. Humans do, and because of that, we often mistake narration for awareness itself. So when narration fades, it can feel like something essential is being lost. In truth, what is being lost is redundancy. The brain no longer needs to explain itself to itself. It no longer needs to monitor identity. It is safe to let go, but safety is not always recognized consciously. For some people, the fading of mental noise triggers anxiety, a sudden realization, I'm not thinking. This thought, ironically, brings thinking back. The voice jumps in to comment on its own absence, and the silence collapses. This is why mental silence is so difficult to sustain deliberately. The moment you notice it as an object, you activate narration again. That is not failure. It is simply how the system works. Silence is not something the waking mind can hold. It is something the waking mind can only pass through. Night makes that passage unavoidable. No matter how talkative your mind is, no matter how busy your day has been, there comes a point when narration becomes too costly to maintain. The brain chooses efficiency. It stops telling the story, not permanently,
just long enough to rest the machinery. This is not sleep yet. Sleep involves deeper changes, but this in-between state, where noise thins and awareness remains, is where something important happens. It reveals that the talking mind is only one layer of consciousness, a dominant layer, a useful one, but not the foundation. Beneath it, there is a quieter form of knowing, one that does not rely on words, one that does not organize experience into a timeline, one that does not ask who you are. And once you sense that this layer exists, even briefly, the noise of the day begins to sound different. Less like truth, more like activity, less like identity, more like function. The voice in your head is not lying to you, but it is not the whole of you either. It is a tool that speaks when needed and rests when it can. And as night deepens, that rest becomes inevitable. The talking brain will continue to soften. Thoughts will continue to fragment. Gaps will grow longer. And eventually, the system will slip past narration entirely, not into nothingness, but into a form of awareness that does not require explanation. And as you remain here, listening, your own mind may already be following that pattern. The noise still present, but thinner than before. Because understanding the noise is often the first step toward noticing what remains when the brain finally allows itself to stop talking. The brain does not sleep the way the body sleeps. Your muscles can shut down, your eyes can close, your posture can collapse into stillness. But the brain never fully powers off. Even in the deepest night, even in the heaviest sleep, it is still active, monitoring, regulating, keeping the internal world stable enough for life to continue without supervision. This is where many assumptions quietly break apart. We tend to imagine sleep as absence, as if consciousness simply disappears and returns hours later, intact. But from the brain's perspective, sleep is not disappearance. It is reorganization. Think of a city at night, the streets empty. The offices darken, the voices fade, but underground, systems are still running. Electricity flows, water moves, signals travel. The city is quieter, not dead. Your brain behaves the same way. When you lie down at night, what disappears first is not awareness, it is performance. During the day, the brain performs constantly. It presents you with a coherent world, a continuous sense of self, a narrative that explains what matters and why. That performance requires precision. Attention must be sharp, memory must be accessible, language must be ready at all times. This is expensive. So when night arrives, the brain begins to shut down the parts that are no longer necessary. Not all at once, not cleanly, in layers. And the first layer to soften is the one responsible for telling the story. This creates a strange contradiction. From the outside, sleep looks like nothing is happening. From the inside, the brain is extremely busy. It is sorting information, rebalancing chemistry, strengthening some connections and weakening others. But it does all of this without needing to explain itself to you. Narration becomes optional. That is why the moment before sleep feels so different from waking life. You are still aware, but awareness no longer comes with a running commentary. The brain is working, just not for the version of you that listens to thoughts. This is often misunderstood as unconsciousness, but unconsciousness is something else entirely. Unconsciousness is the loss of awareness. What happens before sleep is not that. It is the loss of explanation. You stop being told what is happening, even though things are still happening.
This distinction matters because it reveals something subtle about how consciousness works. We tend to assume that consciousness and thinking are the same thing, that to be aware is to be thinking. But the brain itself does not agree. It treats thinking as one mode among many, a useful one, a dominant one during the day, but not a required one for awareness to exist. This becomes obvious in the moments when thinking fades, but experience continues. Sound still arrives, sensation still exists, time still passes. What disappears is the voice that connects these elements into a story.
This is why the phrase, "the brain never sleeps," can be misleading. The brain absolutely rests, but it rests selectively. It shuts down certain functions so that others can operate more efficiently. Narration is one of the first to go because it is not essential for maintenance. In fact, narration often interferes with what the brain needs to do at night. The constant evaluation of experience. Is this important? Should I remember this? How does this fit my identity? Is a daytime priority. At night, those questions are noise. They slow the deeper processes down. So the brain does something elegant. It removes the questions, not by answering them, but by silencing the system that asks. This is why you cannot follow the brain into sleep with logic. The tools you use to stay awake, language, planning, reflection, are the very tools the brain is setting aside. Trying to think your way into sleep is like trying to keep a light on while unplugging it. The more you insist on awareness through thought, the longer the transition takes. But when the brain is allowed to do what it is designed to do, the shift happens smoothly. Thoughts thin, language dissolves, experience becomes simple, not meaningful, not meaningless, just present. This is not something the brain learns, it is something it remembers. You have been entering this state every night since infancy. Before you learned language, this was your default mode, awareness without narration. As children, we move in and out of this state easily. We stare, we drift. We lose ourselves in sensation without needing to explain it. Language comes later, and with it, the sense that thinking is who we are. But the brain never forgets how to function without it. Night gives it permission to return there. This is why people often describe the moments before sleep as oddly familiar, as if something ancient is resurfacing, not a memory, a mode. The brain is not trying to teach you anything here. It is not delivering insight, it is simply switching contexts. The problem is that the wakened mind does not like losing context. It relies on continuity. When continuity weakens, the mind reacts, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with discomfort. This reaction is important because it explains why some people resist sleep, not consciously, not deliberately, but subtly. They reach for stimulation, they scroll, they replay the day. They keep narration alive because narration feels like control. Silence feels like disappearance, but disappearance is not what's happening. Control is just being handed back to the systems that do not speak. This becomes even clearer when we look at what happens after narration fades completely. In deep sleep, you are not aware in the way you are now, but the brain is still deeply active. In fact, some of its most important work only happens when awareness is offline. This tells us something crucial. Awareness is not the brain's priority. Stability is. Survival is. Balance is. Conscious experience is secondary, useful, but not required for the organism to function. This realization can feel
unsettling. It suggests that the sense of I is not central, not permanent, not always present. But it also suggests something else, that the self you experience during the day is not fragile. It can disappear for hours and return intact. Every morning, your identity reassembles itself without effort. Memories reconnect. Preferences return. Concerns reappear. You do not have to rebuild yourself. The brain does it automatically, which means the silence of night is not a threat. It is a pause, a reset, a letting go that does not erase anything. And this is why the moment before sleep is so revealing. It shows you that awareness can exist without effort, without narration, without constant self-reference, not forever, but long enough to remind the system that rest is possible. The brain stops talking not because it has nothing left to say, but because talking is no longer useful. And as it quiets itself, it opens space for another kind of functioning, one that does not announce itself, one that does not ask for attention, one that simply operates. As you stay here listening, your own brain may be approaching that same shift, the words still arriving, the understanding still forming, but something underneath beginning to loosen, not yet silent, just less insistent, because the brain that never sleeps also knows when to stop explaining. And in the next part of this recording, we will move closer to that exact threshold, the point where explanation breaks down, language fragments, and awareness remains without needing to say a word. Silence is often misunderstood. When people hear the phrase mental silence, they imagine emptiness, a blank screen, a mind wiped clean. But that image is inaccurate, because when the brain becomes silent, experience does not disappear. It changes its texture. Mental silence is not the absence of consciousness, it is the absence of commentary. This distinction is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is usually missed. During the day, experience arrives wrapped in explanation. You don't just see light, you see a room. You don't just hear sound, you hear a car passing, a voice, a notification. Every sensation is immediately named, categorized, placed into a story. This happens so fast that it feels inseparable from perception itself. But naming is not perception, naming is an overlay. And at night, that overlay begins to peel away. When mental silence approaches, nothing dramatic announces it. There is no clear boundary. Instead, something small happens first. Thoughts lose urgency. They still appear, but they no longer demand completion. A sentence starts and dissolves. An image flickers and fades before meaning forms. You may notice this as confusion, or as drowsiness, or as that familiar sense of, I can't quite focus anymore. But what is actually happening is not loss of awareness, it is loss of structure. Language provides structure. It organizes time into before and after. It organizes identity into subject and object. It organizes experience into cause and effect. When language weakens, those structures loosen. Time stretches, moments feel longer or oddly compressed. The sense of, I am doing this, becomes softer. There is still sensation, but less ownership. This is why silence can feel strange, not because nothing is there, but because what is there no longer arrives labeled. The brain is still receiving input, still processing signals, still maintaining balance. But it has stopped translating those processes into a story for you. In waking life, the brain acts like a reporter. It narrates events as they happen. At night, that reporter goes off duty, The newsroom stays open. The machines keep running, but no one is writing headlines anymore. This is mental silence, not darkness, not void, just experience without a narrator. This is also why mental silence is almost impossible to remember. Memory depends on narrative. To remember something, the brain needs markers. Who was there? What happened? Why it mattered? But in silence, there is no who, no what, no why. There is only presence, so the moment passes without being stored. You don't wake up thinking, I experienced silence. You wake up thinking, I slept. The silence is erased by the very mechanism that usually remembers things. This makes silence feel rare. In reality, it happens every night. It just doesn't leave evidence. People who meditate deeply sometimes brush against this state while awake. They describe it in different ways: a sense of spaciousness, a quiet clarity, awareness without effort. But even then, the moment they describe it, language returns. The description replaces the experience. This is why mental silence cannot be explained directly. It can only be approached. And the easiest approach is not through discipline or technique. It is through sleep. Sleep does not require understanding. It does not ask you to do anything. It simply waits until the brain is ready to let go. Right before sleep, the conditions are perfect. Attention is soft. The body is still. External demands are low. The brain no longer needs to maintain a social self. It no longer needs to solve problems. It no longer needs to defend identity. So narration fades. What remains is not nothing. It is raw awareness. This awareness feels different from waking consciousness. It is wider, less focused. It does not move from thought to thought. It does not ask questions. It does not look ahead. It simply exists. This is why people sometimes say they feel like they are floating or melting or drifting away. Without language, there is nothing to hold on to. No edges, no definitions, just sensation unfolding. For some, this feels comforting, a deep relief, as if a heavy task has finally been set down. For others, it feels unsettling, a sudden loss of control, because control depends on language. To control something, you must be able to think about it, plan, predict, intervene. Mental silence removes those tools, and when the tools disappear, the mind reacts, sometimes with panic. A quick thought flashes, I'm disappearing. But that thought is narration trying to reassert itself. It is the system attempting to stay online. Silence does not erase you. It only pauses the story of you. And the brain knows how to resume that story later. It has done so thousands of times before. Every morning, identity returns without effort. So, silence is not dangerous. It is unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity is often misread as threat. The truth is, mental silence is one of the safest states the brain can enter. It signals that nothing urgent is happening. No threats detected, no actions required. It is a sign of trust. The brain trusts the environment enough to stop explaining it. This trust is fragile. It cannot be forced. The moment you try to hold silence, the brain interprets that effort as a task, and tasks require narration, so silence slips away. This is why sleep is such a reliable doorway. You don't enter silence by aiming for it. You enter it by allowing fatigue to lower the system's defenses. As the night deepens, the voice grows weaker. Thoughts arrive slower. Gaps widen. Eventually, there is a stretch of time with no words at all. You are still aware, but there is nothing to say, nothing to label, nothing to solve. And because nothing needs solving, the brain continues its descent, past silence, past awareness, into deeper stages where even perception dissolves. But that comes later. Right now, we are staying with this edge, this fragile zone where awareness exists without explanation. Because this is the point where many people become curious. They ask, if silence feels like this, what exactly separates it from sleep? Where does awareness end and unconsciousness begin? And what happens in the brain at the precise moment language breaks down completely? That boundary, thin, unstable, and passed through every night, is where we are going next. There is a paradox at the center of mental silence. The more you want it, the further away it moves. The moment you decide, I want my mind to be quiet, the mind has already begun speaking again, not softly, not gently, but with purpose. This is why so many people feel frustrated when they try to quiet their thoughts. They sit down, they close their eyes, they breathe slowly, and almost immediately, the mind becomes louder than before. Memories surface, plans interrupt, random images appear without invitation. It feels like failure, but nothing has gone wrong. What you are experiencing is not resistance, it is function. The talking mind does not turn itself off because it has been asked to. It turns itself off when it is no longer needed, and need is not determined by desire. It is determined by context. During the day, the context demands narration. You need to orient yourself. You need to respond. You need to decide. Even when you sit still, the brain treats stillness as temporary. It stays alert. Because in waking life, stillness is often followed by action, so the system remains online. This is why silence cannot be forced through effort. Effort itself is a signal that something matters. And when something matters, the brain talks. This is also why silence appears so reliably before sleep. Not because you're doing anything right, but because the context has changed. The lights are lower, the body is tired, the world is quieter. There are no demands waiting on the other side of the moment. Tomorrow exists, but it is far away. Right now, nothing requires explanation. The brain senses this long before you think about it. It begins to shift priorities. Systems responsible for action and planning gradually step back. Attention widens, then loosens, and the talking mind, finding no urgent task to serve, begins to power down. This is not surrender. It is efficiency. The brain is conserving energy by shutting off what it does not need. The problem is that the waking mind does not trust this process. It has learned to equate thinking with safety. So when thoughts begin to fade, it reacts, often unconsciously. A small tension appears, a subtle attempt to hold on. A thought pops up, am I falling asleep? That single thought can pull narration back online, because now there is something to monitor. This is why the edge before sleep can feel unstable. Silence tries to arrive and the mind interrupts it. Not out of fear, exactly, out of habit. Habits are powerful because they operate below intention. You don't choose to narrate your experience. Narration happens automatically whenever the brain detects relevance. What night does is remove relevance, slowly, nothing urgent, nothing to prepare for. And without relevance, language loses its job. This explains something else that often confuses people: why silence feels deeper when you are exhausted. After a long day, thoughts still appear, but they lack force. They don't carry momentum. They drift. This is not because exhaustion improves awareness. It is because exhaustion weakens control. The brain simply does not have the energy to maintain narration at full strength. So silence leaks in through the cracks. This is also why the same person can struggle to quiet their mind during the day, but fall into silence effortlessly at night. Nothing about their skill has changed. Only the conditions. The brain is not responding to instruction. It is responding to environment. This has important implications. It means that silence is not an achievement. It is not something you earn. It is something that happens when the system feels safe enough to stop explaining itself. This is why so many descriptions of mental silence are misleading. They frame it as a goal, a state to reach, a marker of progress. But the brain does not recognize goals in the way the conscious mind does. It recognizes signals, light, sound, movement, fatigue. And when those signals align, it does what it has always done. It quiets itself. This is also why silence cannot be held. Even if you touch it briefly, the moment you notice it, the noticing itself becomes content. A thought arises. This is silence. That thought breaks the silence. Not because you did something wrong, but because naming activates narration. Silence has no defense against language. Language overwrites it instantly. This makes silence fragile, but it also makes it honest. You cannot fake it. You cannot perform it. You cannot convince yourself you are silent. Either narration is happening or it is not. And when it is not, there is nothing to report. This brings us to another misunderstanding. Many people believe that mental silence means stopping all mental activity. But that is not what happens. Activity continues. The brain still processes sensation, still regulates the body, still responds to the environment. What stops is the running commentary. This is why silence often feels full, not empty. There is texture, warmth, weight, subtle movement, but no interpretation, no evaluation, no story. This is also why silence can feel strangely intimate. Without narration, there is no distance between experience and awareness. Nothing stands between you and what is happening. There is no mediator, just contact. This contact is brief. It does not last, because the brain is not designed to stay in this state indefinitely. Silence is a doorway, not a destination. It leads toward sleep, toward deeper disengagement, toward states where even awareness softens. But before that happens, there is a window, a narrow one, where awareness exists without words. This is the window we keep brushing against at night, and because it passes so quickly, it leaves an impression, a sense of relief, or calm, or unease. Something shifts, but you can't say what. This impression is important because it teaches the nervous system something, that it is possible to exist without constant narration, that nothing breaks when the voice stops, that the self can pause and return intact. Over time, this realization changes the relationship you have with your thoughts. They begin to feel less absolute, less essential, more like activity than identity. You start to sense that the talking mind is one layer among others, a useful one, but not the core. And this awareness, even when it remains subtle, makes the night feel different. Sleep becomes less of a fall and more of a slide, a gradual letting go rather than a loss of control. But there is still a boundary ahead. Silence is not the end of the transition. It is the last place where awareness still recognizes itself.
Beyond it, something else begins, a space where language is gone, but awareness has not yet disappeared. A place where images emerge without logic, where time fractures, where the mind is no longer awake, but not yet asleep. That unstable region, often overlooked, often misunderstood, is where we are going next. Because it is there, at the precise moment when language breaks down, that the brain reveals how consciousness actually fades, not abruptly, but in stages, like light dimming room by room, until nothing needs to be seen anymore. There is a moment that does not belong to the day and does not yet belong to sleep. It is not marked by a clock. It does not announce itself. Most people pass through it without realizing it was ever there. But the brain knows this moment well. It is the threshold, the exact point where waking logic loosens and the architecture of sleep begins to assemble itself piece by piece. At this threshold, nothing dramatic happens. There is no clear switch, no sudden blackout. Instead, the mind begins to behave strangely. Thoughts no longer arrive in full form. They appear incomplete, as if the brain has stopped finishing its own sentences. You may notice a phrase forming and then dissolving before meaning locks in. An image flashes, a face, a place, a color, with no context and no explanation. There is no attempt to connect it to anything. During the day, this would feel like distraction. At night, it feels natural. Because the rules are changing, the brain is no longer trying to maintain coherence. It is preparing to disengage from narrative reality. This is the threshold of sleep, and it is one of the most delicate states the brain ever enters. At this point, awareness still exists. You still know you're here. You still sense the room around you. You still recognize sound and sensation. But your grip on sequence is weakening. Time begins to behave differently. Moments stretch, then collapse. You may feel as if several seconds pass inside a single breath, or as if minutes vanish without notice. This distortion is not a malfunction. It is a signal. The brain is stepping away from linear processing. Linear processing requires effort. It requires attention, memory, and prediction. At the threshold, the brain is letting go of all three. This is why the state feels slippery. The moment you try to think about it, it shifts. If you try to remember what just happened, the memory feels incomplete, like waking from a dream that never fully formed. This instability is essential. The brain cannot enter sleep while holding on to stable narratives. Narratives create continuity. Sleep requires interruption, so the brain begins to fragment experience, not violently, not abruptly, but gently. Thoughts lose their center. Images appear without ownership. You may feel like you are watching your own mind from a distance, or like you are sinking while awareness stays near the surface. Some people describe this as falling. Others describe it as floating. Both are attempts to explain a loss of orientation. Orientation depends on reference points. Language provides those reference points. When language weakens, direction disappears. Up and down lose meaning. Before and after blur. This is why hypnic sensations, the feeling of dropping, the sudden jolt, the brief muscle twitch, often appear here. The body reacts to disorientation before the mind can interpret it. It is not panic, it is recalibration. The nervous system checking, are we safe enough to let go? Most of the time the answer is yes, and the transition continues. But sometimes, awareness catches itself mid-fade. A sudden clarity appears. A thought arises. I'm about to fall asleep. This thought feels sharp.
almost bright, and instantly the threshold pulls away. Narration snaps back online. Time restabilizes. Thoughts regain structure. The brain has been called back to duty. This is one of the great frustrations of sleep. The closer you get to noticing the transition, the more likely you are to interrupt it, because noticing is an act of narration. And narration is incompatible with sleep. This creates a strange tension. The threshold is real, but it cannot be observed directly. The moment you observe it, it changes, like trying to see darkness by turning on a light. This is why people often believe they fall asleep suddenly. They do not remember the threshold because memory cannot form there. Memory requires structure. The threshold dissolves structure, so the moment disappears without leaving a trace. But just because it is forgotten does not mean it is insignificant. In fact, this is where some of the most important shifts occur. At the threshold, the brain begins to decouple awareness from voluntary control. During the day, awareness and control are tightly linked. You think, you act, you decide, you move. At night, this link weakens. Awareness remains, but action fades. The body grows heavy. Signals from muscles slow. The sense of agency dissolves. You are no longer doing. You are being. This is not yet sleep, but it is no longer waking life. It is a third state, one that exists only briefly and only under the right conditions. This state is fragile. External stimulation can disrupt it easily. Light, sound, movement. Even internal stimulation, a strong emotion, a sudden worry, can pull the brain back. This is why sleep environments matter so much, not because sleep is sensitive, but because the threshold is. Once the brain passes fully into sleep, it becomes surprisingly resilient. But before that, it requires stillness, not silence. Stillness. Stillness of intention. Stillness of demand. This is why lying in bed while planning tomorrow keeps the threshold out of reach. The brain interprets planning as relevance, and relevance requires narration. The threshold only opens when relevance fades, when nothing needs to be solved, when nothing needs to be protected, when nothing needs to be explained. This is also why the threshold often arrives unexpectedly, during long drives, on trains, while staring out a window. Moments when attention softens without deliberate effort, the brain senses the absence of demand and begins to let go. At night, this process is amplified. Fatigue lowers resistance. Chemistry shifts. The brain's priorities reorder themselves. Systems that monitor the external world step back. Systems that regulate internal balance move forward. And awareness, once sharp and verbal, becomes diffuse and quiet. This diffusion is not loss, it is redistribution. Awareness spreads out instead of pointing inward. It stops watching itself. It stops commenting. It simply rests in sensation. This is why the threshold can feel strangely intimate. Without narration, there is no observer separate from experience. There is no one watching the breath. There is just breathing, no one listening to sound, just sound. No one thinking about the body, just sensation. The sense of me becomes transparent, not gone, just no longer outlined. This transparency can feel peaceful, but it can also feel unsettling, because identity depends on edges. When edges soften, identity loosens. Some people experience a flash of fear here, a sudden tightening, a reflexive return to thought. This is not weakness, it is conditioning. The brain has learned to associate awareness with control. When control fades, the system reacts. But over time, as the threshold is crossed night after night, the nervous system learns something important, that letting go does not lead to harm, that the body continues breathing, that the brain continues functioning, that the self returns in the morning. This learning happens implicitly. No insight is required. The system simply experiences safety repeatedly, and gradually resistance softens. The threshold becomes easier to pass, not because you try harder, but because you interfere less. This is why people often say their sleep improves with age, not because the brain becomes better, but because the mind becomes less demanding. It stops insisting on control at all times. It trusts the process. The threshold is where that trust is tested, and most nights the brain passes through it quietly. Silence deepens, awareness thins, images fragment, and then, without a clear boundary, awareness fades into sleep. But before it does, there is one more transformation, a state where awareness still exists, but reality no longer follows waking rules, where images emerge without logic, where time folds in on itself, where identity is present but unstable. This is the region between waking and dreaming, and it is there in that unstable space that the brain begins to speak again, not in words, but in images, fragments, symbols. And once that happens, the night enters a new phase entirely. There comes a point where language does not fade gently. It breaks, not suddenly, not violently, but unmistakably. Up until now, words have been thinning, losing urgency, losing structure. But at this point, the brain stops trying to use them at all. This is where the transition becomes irreversible. Because language is not just a tool for communication, it is a tool for orientation. As long as language functions, the brain can maintain a sense of position. Who is here? What is happening? When it is happening? When language breaks down, those coordinates dissolve, and the mind enters a state that does not belong to waking life. At first, the breakdown feels subtle. You may notice that thoughts no longer arrive as words. Instead, they appear as impressions, a vague sense of familiarity, a shape without a name, a feeling without an explanation. You might sense meaning without being able to say what it is. This is not confusion. It is pre-verbal awareness. The kind of awareness that exists before language organizes experience. During the day, this mode is buried. Language dominates perception, but at night, as the system powers down, older layers resurface, layers that existed long before words were learned. This is why the experience feels strange. You are conscious, but not articulate. You know something is happening, but you cannot describe it. You might try, and immediately realize there are no words available. The brain is no longer translating experience into symbolic form. It is no longer compressing reality into language. Instead, experience flows directly. Sensation, image, emotion, all without commentary. This is the moment where many people report random images appearing. A staircase, a face, a place you've never seen. These images do not arrive like memories. They do not feel chosen. They simply appear and disappear. This is important because it shows that imagination, like language, is not fully under conscious control. When narration shuts down, other systems are free to express themselves. Visual processing remains active. Emotional associations still exist. But without language, they do not form stories. They form fragments. This is the beginning of dream logic, but it is not dreaming yet. Dreaming requires deeper disengagement. What you are experiencing here is the mind rehearsing a new mode of operation, a mode where meaning is not explained, only felt. This is why images at this stage often feel incomplete. They lack continuity. They do not follow rules. They flicker, appear, dissolve. Sometimes they merge with sensation. A sound becomes a shape. A feeling becomes a color. The boundaries between senses soften. This blending is not random. It reflects a shift in how the brain is coordinating information. During waking life, different sensory systems are carefully separated. Vision stays vision. Sound stays sound. Language acts as a central organizer, keeping everything in its category. When language steps back, that separation loosens. The brain begins to integrate information in broader, less structured ways. This is why the state feels dreamlike even before dreaming begins. But there is still a crucial difference. Awareness has not yet disappeared. You are still there. You still know that you're lying down. You still have a faint sense of self, but that sense is unstable. It flickers, just like the images. Sometimes it feels present. Sometimes it dissolves. This instability is not an error. It is part of the transition. The brain is testing how much structure it can remove without losing regulation. Think of it like dimming lights. You don't turn them off instantly. You lower them gradually, checking visibility at each step. Language is one of the brightest lights. When it goes out, everything else looks different. Without words, the brain cannot maintain a continuous narrative. Without narrative, time loses coherence. You may feel like you have been in this state for a long time, or no time at all. Both impressions can coexist. This is because the sense of duration depends heavily on language and memory. When both weaken, time becomes subjective. This is why you cannot accurately estimate how long it takes you to fall asleep. The brain does not record the threshold. It only records the states before and after. Everything in between is blurred. This is also why people often feel as if sleep just happens. They don't remember drifting. They remember being awake, then being asleep. The language-free zone in between leaves no record. But while it is happening, it is far from empty. The mind is active in a different way, not constructing stories, not evaluating meaning, but allowing material to surface without judgment. This is why emotions can appear here without cause, a sudden warmth, a sense of sadness, a quiet joy. There is no narrative attached, just feeling. During the day, emotion is usually explained. I feel this because at night, emotion can exist without reason, and because it is not explained, it does not escalate. It passes. This is another sign that the brain is preparing for sleep. Sleep requires emotional regulation. The constant analysis of feeling would interfere with that. So explanation is removed. Feeling remains. And because feeling is not being interpreted, it does not demand response. This allows the system to settle. At this point, trying to stay awake becomes very difficult, not because the body is tired, but because the tools of wakefulness are no longer available. You cannot think clearly because clarity requires language. You cannot plan because planning requires narrative. You cannot reflect because reflection requires memory. All you can do is experience what arises, and what arises is increasingly disconnected from waking reality. Images lose their link to the present moment. They no longer reflect the room around you. They come from elsewhere. Internal sources, associative networks, fragments of memory mixed with imagination. This is the mind turning inward, not deliberately, automatically. The external world is no longer prioritized. The brain begins to generate its own environment. This is the beginning of dreaming. But again, this is not full dreaming yet, because in dreams, you are usually inside the images. Here, you're still watching them appear. This distinction matters. It marks the last stage where awareness still has a foothold. Once that foothold is lost, the transition completes itself. But before that happens, there is a fragile balance. Awareness without language, images without ownership, self without stability. This is a rare configuration. It does not last long, but it reveals something fundamental. That consciousness does not require words. That meaning does not require explanation. That identity does not require continuity. The brain can function, even generate experience, without telling a story about it. And once this becomes clear, even faintly, the nature of waking consciousness changes. Thoughts feel less authoritative. Language feels less absolute. You begin to sense that the voice in your head is not the source of awareness. It is one expression of it, one mode. And at night, that mode steps aside, allowing others to emerge. The breakdown of language is not the end of experience. It is a handoff, from waking logic to dream logic, from explanation to immersion, from observing to participating. And as this handoff completes, awareness itself begins to change form. It no longer stands apart. It no longer watches. It enters. In the next stage, the images will no longer flicker at a distance. They will surround you. Time will no longer stretch and collapse. It will rearrange itself. And the sense of you will no longer hover at the edge of experience. It will dissolve into the experience itself. That is the moment when the threshold is truly crossed, when the brain stops talking and starts dreaming. There is a space the brain enters where it no longer belongs fully to the waking world, but has not yet committed to the dream. It is a narrow space, unstable, easy to miss, and yet it is one of the most revealing states the human mind ever experiences, because here the rules that govern reality begin to dissolve, while awareness still lingers long enough to notice the change. This is the region between waking and dreaming, not a clean line, not a doorway, more like fog. In this space, images no longer feel like thoughts. They do not announce themselves as imagination. They simply appear. A hallway that does not exist, a voice without a source, a scene with no past. And yet, for a brief moment, you know you are seeing them. This knowing is fragile. It flickers. Sometimes you feel present, hovering at the edge of the image. Other times, you are already inside it before you realize what has happened. This instability is not random. It is the brain testing a new configuration. During waking life, the brain maintains a strict separation between perception and imagination. What comes from the senses is treated as real. What comes from within is labeled as thought, memory, or fantasy. This separation is essential for survival. But at night, that distinction becomes less important. The external world is no longer the priority. So the boundary softens. Internal images begin to carry more weight, not because they are more vivid, but because there is no longer a narrator to remind you where they came from. Without language, the brain cannot say, "This is just a thought." So images are allowed to exist without explanation. They are not questioned. They are not corrected. They are simply experienced. This is why the transition feels dreamlike before dreaming officially begins. But there is still a difference. In this in-between state, the images are unstable. They flicker, change shape, collapse. They do not yet form a world. That requires a deeper shift. Right now, awareness is still partially anchored to the body. You still feel the weight of yourself lying down. You still sense the room, even if faintly. This anchor keeps the images from fully taking over, so they remain fragments, scenes without continuity, faces without identity, places without geography. They feel significant, but not meaningful. Compelling, but not coherent. This is often where people experience what they later describe as almost dreaming. They remember flashes, a staircase that led nowhere, a sentence that made sense and then didn't, a moment where reality bent slightly, then snapped back. These flashes are not random. They are the brain rehearsing immersion. Before it lets go completely, it tests how experience behaves when narrative control is absent. This rehearsal is important. Dreaming is not chaos. It is a highly organized state, but its organization is different. Instead of logic and sequence, dreams use association. One image leads to another, not because it makes sense, but because it feels connected. During the day, the brain suppresses this mode. At night, it begins to reassert itself. In the in-between state, both systems are active at once. Waking logic is fading. Dream logic is emerging. The overlap creates instability. This instability is often felt as strangeness, a sense that something is off but not wrong. Reality feels flexible. Objects may shift. Voices may come from nowhere. Time may loop, and yet you're still aware enough to notice that something has changed. This awareness is the last thing to go, and because it lingers, it can create a feeling of being stuck. Some people experience this as sleep paralysis, others as vivid hypnagogic imagery, others simply as confusion. But all of these experiences share a common root. They occur when the brain has disengaged language but has not yet fully disengaged awareness. In other words, the narrator is gone, but the observer remains. This is an unusual configuration. In waking life, observer and narrator are tightly linked. You observe by narrating, you know by naming. At night, those roles separate. Observation can exist without explanation. Knowing can exist without words. This is deeply unfamiliar to the waking mind, which is why this state is often remembered as eerie or intense. The brain is doing something it almost never does during the day. It is allowing awareness to float free of structure. And when structure dissolves, the sense of self dissolves with it. Not completely, but enough to feel unstable. You may feel as if you're no longer located behind your eyes, or as if perspective shifts without warning. You may feel very large or very small, or as if your body has lost clear boundaries. These sensations are not hallucinations. They are the result of the brain reducing spatial mapping. During waking life, the brain constantly tracks where the body is in space. At night, that tracking becomes less precise. It is no longer needed. So the sense of location softens. The result is a feeling of expansion or contraction, floating or sinking. These sensations are often interpreted through metaphor, falling, drifting, melting, because metaphor is all that remains when language is gone. The brain still tries to make sense of what is happening, but it no longer has the tools to do so precisely. So it gestures, it hints, It lets sensation speak for itself. This is also why fear can arise here. Not because anything dangerous is happening, but because the usual markers of safety have disappeared. Safety during the day is defined by predictability, by knowing where you are, what is happening, and what will happen next. In the in-between state, predictability collapses. The future does not exist. The past is inaccessible. Only the present remains, and it does not explain itself. For some nervous systems, this feels like relief. For others, it feels like threat. The difference is not psychological, it is physiological. How accustomed the system is to letting go of control. People who resist this state often pull themselves back with thought. They replay something familiar. They tense their body. They open their eyes. And the brain snaps back into waking mode. The threshold is missed. Others drift through it without noticing. The images become stronger. The sense of body fades, and suddenly they are no longer observing. They are inside. This is the exact moment dreaming begins. But from the inside, it does not feel like a beginning. It feels like continuity, because there is no narrator to mark the transition. From the brain's perspective, nothing has been lost. Only the mode has changed. The world has moved from external to internal. The rules have shifted, but experience continues. This is an important realization, because it shows that consciousness does not turn off. It transforms. The brain does not lose awareness when it enters sleep. It relocates it from the senses to internally generated reality. From monitoring to participation, the in-between state is where this relocation occurs, and because it is brief, it often goes unnoticed, but its effects linger. It shapes how dreams form, how sleep deepens, how rested you feel. When the transition is smooth, sleep feels effortless. When it is disrupted, sleep feels shallow. The difference often lies here, in whether the brain is allowed to complete this handoff without interruption. This is why late-night stimulation has such a powerful effect. Bright screens, sharp sounds, emotional content. They reactivate narration, they pull awareness back into waking mode, and the in-between state collapses. The brain must start over. This is also why some people fall asleep easily, but wake up repeatedly.
They pass through the threshold, but do not remain past it. The handoff is incomplete. Awareness keeps snapping back. Understanding this changes how we think about sleep. Sleep is not something you fall into. It is something the brain transitions through. In stages, each stage requires the release of a different function: language, control, orientation, self-reference. The in-between state is where the release of language meets the release of identity. And once identity loosens, dreams can take hold. But before that happens, there is one last remnant of the waking self, a subtle observer, a sense of, I am here. This observer does not speak, it does not comment. It simply notices, and when it finally dissolves, there is no announcement, no awareness of loss, no gap. Just immersion. The dream does not begin, it is already happening, and by the time the narrator returns, hours later in the morning, this entire journey will be gone, remembered only as sleep. But the brain remembers, it remembers the path, and tonight it will walk it again, quietly, naturally, without asking you to understand any of it. There is a moment, brief, almost weightless, when awareness is still present, but there is no longer anyone inside it who can say, I am aware. This is not confusion. It is not loss.
It is awareness without a center. Up until now, even as language faded, even as images began to form, there was still a subtle position, a vantage point, something that felt like me watching this happen. But in this stage, that position begins to dissolve. Not violently, not suddenly. It thins. The observer does not disappear. It spreads. And when awareness spreads, there is no longer a clear place from which to observe. This is one of the most unfamiliar experiences the brain can produce, because throughout waking life, awareness is always localized. It feels like it sits behind the eyes, or inside the head, or somewhere just behind thought. This localization is not accidental. It helps the brain coordinate perception. It gives experience a reference point. But at night, as the systems responsible for orientation disengage, that reference point softens. Awareness is no longer located. It is simply present. You may sense this as a loss of perspective, not blindness, not darkness, just a lack of position. There is no longer a sense of I am here, looking at that. There is only this is happening. This is the observer without words, an awareness that does not describe itself, an awareness that does not stand apart. It does not say, I see an image. There is just the image. It does not say, I feel my body. There is just sensation, or sometimes no sensation at all, because sensation itself is no longer being interpreted. This is why people struggle to talk about this state. Any attempt to describe it reintroduces language, and language reintroduces position. So the description always misses the experience. What can be said carefully is that awareness here feels impersonal, not in a cold way, in a neutral way. There is no ownership. Experience is not happening to you. It is simply unfolding. This is where many philosophical ideas about consciousness originate, not from theory, but from this direct experience. The realization that awareness does not require a narrator. That perception does not require a self standing behind it. But at night, this realization is not framed as insight. It is not framed at all. It is simply lived through and then forgotten, because memory cannot store it. Memory needs an anchor, a perspective, a point of view. When the point of view dissolves, nothing is recorded. This is why the observer without words is almost never remembered. You may remember the images. You may remember falling asleep. But you will not remember the moment when awareness stopped belonging to anyone. And yet, this moment is crucial, because it marks the final step before full immersion. Up until now, you have been hovering, watching fragments arise, sensing the drift. But once the observer dissolves, there is no hovering, there is no distance. Experience no longer happens in front of you. It surrounds you. This is the exact point where dreams stop being watched and start being lived. But even here, there is a pause, a brief suspension, awareness without language, awareness without identity, a pure field. It does not last long. The brain does not linger here, because this state is transitional, not stable. The brain is reconfiguring itself. Networks are shifting. Control is being handed over from waking systems to dreaming systems. This handoff requires a moment of neutrality, a clearing. That clearing is the observer without words. Some people brush against this state during deep meditation. They describe it as vastness, or openness, or emptiness that feels full. But during sleep, there is no description, no meaning assigned, just passage. This is also why fear can no longer arise here. Fear requires interpretation. It requires a self who feels threatened. In this state, there is no such self. There is no one to be afraid, which is why, once you pass this point, sleep becomes inevitable. Resistance is no longer possible. There is nothing left to resist with. The tools of waking consciousness, language, control, evaluation, are offline. The observer has dissolved. All that remains is experience itself. And experience, without boundaries, flows easily into dreams. This is the final quiet moment before immersion, the last place where awareness exists without a story, without a face, without a name. And once this place is crossed, there is no sense of crossing. There is no marker, no awareness of transition, because awareness has changed its form. It is no longer watching, it is participating. The brain has completed its descent, not into darkness, but into a different kind of light, one that does not illuminate from a distance, but surrounds from within. And in the next stage, that light will take shape. It will become scenes, voices, movement. It will become a world that feels real because there is no longer an observer to question it. A world entered not by choice, but by release. That is where the night truly begins. Before there were words, there was already awareness. Before thoughts learned how to line themselves up into sentences, before memory learned how to loop backward and forward, before identity learned how to introduce itself, there was perception without explanation. As a child, you lived there, not occasionally, not as a special state, but as a default. You did not wake up narrating the day. You did not fall asleep analyzing yourself. You moved in and out of silence without noticing that it was silence, because nothing had been lost yet that needed to be named. Think back, not as a memory, but as a feeling, sitting somewhere unfamiliar, watching light move across a wall, lying on the floor, listening to distant sounds without trying to identify them. Moments where time did not feel measured, where you were not bored, but not entertained either, just present. That presence did not require effort. It did not feel like focus. It felt like being. As children, we did not experience silence as absence. There was no contrast. Silence was simply the space in which everything else appeared. But something changed, not all at once, not deliberately. Language arrived. At first it was simple, names for objects, sounds connected to needs, then sentences, then explanations. And slowly, the brain learned a new habit, to narrate. This narration was useful. It helped organize experience. It helped predict outcomes. It helped navigate social worlds. But it came at a cost. Once narration took hold, silence stopped being neutral. It became noticeable, and once something is noticeable, it can be judged. Silence began to feel empty, or uncomfortable, or unproductive. The brain learned to fill it. This shift did not erase the older mode. It buried it, like a layer beneath the surface, still there, still functional, just rarely accessed during the day. Night is when that layer resurfaces, not because the brain regresses, but because it relaxes. The mechanisms that keep narration running, attention, control, social awareness, are not required in sleep, so they step aside. And when they do, the brain returns to something it has always known, awareness without commentary. This is why the silence before sleep often feels oddly familiar. Not new, not foreign, but remembered without memory. As if the system recognizes a shape it once inhabited. This familiarity can be comforting, or it can be unsettling, because the adult mind has learned to associate awareness with thinking, with knowing, with control. When those are removed, the experience feels regressive, but it is not. It is foundational. The silence of childhood was not ignorance. It was openness. The brain had not yet learned to compress reality into language. So experience arrived whole, undivided. This is also why children can become absorbed so easily. They do not need to silence their minds. There is less noise to begin with. Attention moves naturally from one thing to another without commentary. Time stretches. Moments feel long because they are not being measured. As adults, we often try to recreate this state through meditation, through focus, through deliberate quiet. But what we are really trying to do is undo a habit that has been reinforced for years. Narration has become default, and default modes do not shut off easily. This is why the silence of night is so different from deliberate quiet. Night does not ask the brain to unlearn narration. It simply removes the conditions that require it. Social context disappears. Tasks dissolve. Consequences move into the future. The brain senses this, and gradually it allows the older mode to reemerge. This reemergence is not a memory. You do not recall being a child, but your nervous system remembers how to function without constant explanation. That memory is procedural, not declarative. It is stored in patterns, not in stories, which is why it cannot be summoned by thought, only by context, darkness, stillness, fatigue. These are not cues for thinking, they are cues for release. When those cues align, the brain stops insisting on narration, and silence returns, not as something new, but as something resumed. This also explains why the silence of night often feels deeper than any quiet you can create during the day. During the day, silence is layered on top of alertness. At night, silence is layered on top of trust. The brain trusts that nothing is required of it, so it lets go. This trust is not intellectual, it is biological. It does not come from reassurance, it comes from repetition. Every night that the brain passes into sleep and returns safely in the morning, the system learns. Letting go does not equal danger. Silence does not equal loss. Identity can pause and resume intact. This learning accumulates quietly over years, decades, and yet the waking mind rarely acknowledges it, because waking life does not leave much room for it. The day rewards narration, productivity, explanation, analysis. Silence is rarely useful in visible ways, so it is deprioritized. But the brain never forgets its other modes. It only waits for the right conditions. This waiting becomes more apparent as life becomes more complex. The more responsibility the mind carries, the louder narration becomes, and the more valuable silence feels when it finally arrives. This is why adults often describe sleep as refuge, not because they are tired, but because silence is rare during the day. At night, it becomes inevitable, but before it does, the brain often passes through a moment that feels like childhood again, a soft, wordless awareness. No urgency, no evaluation, just presence. This is not nostalgia, it is recognition. The system recognizing a familiar configuration, one that predates language, one that predates identity, one that does not ask who you are or what you should be doing. It simply allows experience to exist. This recognition is subtle. Most people do not notice it. They feel relaxed or drowsy or vaguely peaceful, and then they fall asleep. But the transition matters because it reveals something essential. That the talking mind is not the beginning of awareness. It is an addition, a layer added later, useful, powerful, but not fundamental. Beneath it, there is a quieter mode that does not require effort, that does not demand explanation, that does not insist on continuity. Night gives you access to that mode without asking you to change anything. You do not have to become simpler. You do not have to become wiser. You only have to become tired enough that the brain no longer maintains the performance. This is why sleep is universal. It does not belong to a philosophy. It does not belong to a technique. It belongs to biology. Every human brain returns to silence because silence is part of how the system resets. Without it, narration would consume all available energy. Without it, identity would never rest. Without it, the system would collapse under its own activity. So, silence is not optional. It is mandatory, but it is allowed only under certain conditions. Conditions that resemble the earliest ones. Low stimulation, low demand, safety. These conditions mirror childhood, not emotionally, structurally. In both cases, the brain does not need to defend a complex social self. So narration relaxes, and when narration relaxes, silence emerges. This silence is not something you return to. It is something that was never gone, only covered, like a surface beneath constant motion. Night smooths the motion, and the surface appears, briefly, enough to let the system rest. Enough to remind the brain that it does not need to speak to exist. And once this reminder is received, the transition continues. Silence deepens, awareness loosens further, and the mind moves toward states where even this quiet presence will fade, toward places where identity is no longer even paused, but absent, where experience continues without a center, without memory, without return. That is not something the waking mind can imagine. But the brain knows the path. It has walked it every night. And as childhood silence gives way to something even quieter, the boundary between awareness and unawareness draws closer, not abruptly, but gently, as if the system were lowering itself into a deeper rest it has always trusted. And that deeper rest, beyond silence, beyond observation, is where the next transition begins. The talking brain did not become loud by accident. It was trained, not by a single moment, not by a single rule, but by a slow, continuous shaping that began the moment you entered the social world. As children, we start in silence, but silence does not survive contact with society. The world asks questions. Who are you? What do you want? Why did you do that? And the brain learns very quickly that answers matter. Language becomes more than a tool. It becomes protection. To speak is to belong. To explain is to be understood. To narrate is to be safe. So the brain adapts. It builds a system that can respond instantly, that can justify actions, that can predict reactions. This system runs on words. Inner speech becomes a rehearsal space. Before you speak out loud, you speak inside. Before you act, you narrate. Before you rest, you explain to yourself why rest is allowed. Over time, this narration stops feeling optional. It feels necessary. The brain begins to believe that if it stops talking, something will go wrong. Not immediately, but eventually. This belief is not conscious. It is learned through repetition. Every social interaction reinforces it. You replay conversations. You imagine better responses. You anticipate future exchanges. Even when you are alone, the social world remains active inside you. Voices of others become internalized. Expectations linger. The brain stays alert long after the environment has gone quiet. This is how narration becomes default. Not because the brain wants noise, but because noise has proven useful. In society, silence is ambiguous. A quiet person is questioned. What are they thinking? Are they upset? Are they hiding something? So the brain learns to fill gaps preemptively. Better to speak than be misunderstood. Better to explain than be misread. And this habit extends inward. The brain does not want to misunderstand itself, so it explains everything, every emotion, every impulse, every hesitation. Nothing is allowed to simply exist. Everything must have a reason. This constant self-explanation feels like awareness, but it is actually surveillance. The brain monitoring itself to maintain coherence, to remain legible, not just to others, but to its own internal model of who it is supposed to be. This is why the talking brain is so difficult to quiet. It is not just thinking. It is identity maintenance. To stop narrating feels like letting the mask slip, even when no one is watching, because the brain has learned to always assume an audience. This audience may not be external anymore. It may be an internalized version of parents, peers, culture, but it is there, and as long as the audience exists, the narrator stays on. This has consequences. It means that the brain rarely rests during the day. Even in moments of inactivity, the narrator is busy, evaluating, comparing, judging. Am I doing enough? Am I being productive? Am I falling behind? These questions are not chosen. They are conditioned. They arise automatically because the brain has learned that value is tied to explanation. To be valuable is to have a story. To be acceptable is to be coherent. Silence threatens coherence. Silence creates gaps. And gaps are dangerous in a social system that demands consistency. So the brain fills them relentlessly. This is why modern life feels mentally loud, not because there's more to think about, but because the demand for explanation never truly ends. Even rest is evaluated. Even sleep is optimized. The narrator extends into the night. You lie down, and the brain reviews the day. What you said, what you should have said, what tomorrow will require. This is not because you are anxious. It is because the system has not yet been told that narration is no longer needed. Society trained the brain to stay online. Night must retrain it to let go. This retraining does not happen through instruction. You cannot tell the brain that it is safe to be silent. Safety is not a concept. It is a state. The brain recognizes safety through signals: darkness, stillness, repetition, the absence of demand. When those signals are present long enough, the narrator begins to loosen, not because it has been defeated, but because it has been relieved of duty. This is why silence feels different at night. During the day, silence feels like resistance. At night, silence feels like permission. The social audience fades. There is no one to respond to, no one to impress, no one to justify yourself to. And slowly, the narrator steps back. This stepping back can feel uncomfortable at first because the brain has been trained to equate narration with existence. If I am not thinking, am I still here? This question is not philosophical. It is conditioned. The brain has learned to associate selfhood with internal dialogue. So when dialogue fades, selfhood feels threatened. But this threat is illusory. Identity does not disappear. It pauses. The systems that maintain it rest, and in their absence, something else becomes visible, a quieter form of awareness, one that does not perform, one that does not explain, one that does not care how it appears. This awareness has no social function. It does not help you navigate conversations. It does not plan. It does not evaluate. Which is why society does not reward it. But biology does. This awareness is restorative. It allows the nervous system to downshift. It allows energy to redistribute. It allows the brain to recalibrate without interference. The talking brain is excellent at interaction, but it is terrible at rest. Left unchecked, it would run continuously. Night exists to stop it, not permanently, just long enough. This is why sleep deprivation is so destabilizing. It is not just the lack of rest, it is the lack of silence. Without silence, the narrator never steps back. The brain remains in a state of constant explanation. And eventually, the system frays. Emotion regulation breaks down, memory becomes unreliable, identity becomes unstable. The brain needs silence to maintain coherence. Ironically, silence preserves the self by temporarily suspending it. This is not something society teaches. In fact, society often teaches the opposite. That constant awareness is virtuous. That being on is necessary. That silence is wasted time. So the brain internalizes this pressure. It narrates even when exhausted. It explains even when nothing needs explanation. It stays alert long after alertness has stopped being useful. Night is the only time this pressure reliably lifts, because night removes the social context. You are not required to be anything. You are not expected to respond. You are not being observed. Even if the brain has trouble believing this at first, repetition teaches it. Night after night, the same pattern occurs. Narration fades, silence emerges, sleep follows, and the system resets. This reset is not a luxury, it is maintenance. The talking brain is a cultural achievement, but silence is a biological necessity. One cannot replace the other. They serve different purposes. The mistake many people make is trying to solve nighttime silence with daytime tools. They try to think their way into rest. They try to analyze their inability to sleep. They turn silence into a task. But tasks activate narration, and narration delays rest. The only way silence arrives is when the brain is convinced that it no longer needs to perform. Night provides that conviction, slowly, relentlessly, without argument. And when the talking brain finally steps aside, it does not feel like failure. It feels like relief, not because something has been gained, but because something heavy has been set down, a responsibility the brain has been carrying all day, to explain, to monitor, to maintain. Silence removes that responsibility. For a few hours, the brain is allowed to simply function without narrating itself, without justifying its existence, without asking who it is. This is why silence before sleep often feels like surrender. But it is not surrender to nothing. It is surrender to a deeper intelligence, one that does not speak, one that does not argue, one that has been keeping you alive long before words existed. And as the social voice fades, as the trained narrator steps back, the night continues its work. The brain moves further away from performance, further away from identity, closer to a state where even awareness itself will soften, where the last traces of the social self will dissolve. And beyond that point, there is no training, no conditioning, no language, only the quiet machinery of sleep, working without explanation. That is where we are heading next. Into the part of the night where the brain no longer remembers how to talk at all. When the night deepens, something subtle but decisive happens. The brain stops negotiating. Up until this point, there has been a quiet back and forth, narration fading, then briefly returning, awareness loosening, then tightening again, the system testing, checking, reassuring itself that it is safe to continue. But eventually, that dialogue ends, not because the brain wins the argument, but because there is no longer an argument to have. This is the moment when nighttime fully disarms the mind, not through force, not through control, through irrelevance. During the day, the brain stays sharp because it must. There are consequences to missing information. There are demands that require response. There is a world that can surprise you. At night, that world recedes, and when the external world recedes, the internal defenses lose their purpose. The mind does not become quiet because it is ordered to. It becomes quiet because nothing is asking it to stay loud. This disarming happens gradually, but once it passes a certain point, there is no turning back. Thoughts no longer return with clarity. Even if a sentence tries to form, it dissolves before it can anchor. The mental voice that once commented on everything now feels distant, muted, as if it is speaking from another room with the door almost closed. This is not exhaustion. It is disengagement. Exhaustion still struggles. Disengagement does not. The difference is important. When the mind is exhausted but still engaged, thoughts feel heavy, repetitive, intrusive. When the mind is disengaged, thoughts feel irrelevant. They may appear, but they do not hook attention. They pass through without consequence. This is the point where people often say, "I couldn't even think if I tried." And they are right. Not because the brain is incapable, but because the systems that support deliberate thinking are offline. Attention, working memory, goal tracking, these are waking tools. Nighttime deprioritizes them. The brain reallocates resources toward regulation, toward maintenance, toward internal balance. This shift is quiet. There is no sensation of machinery changing gears. You simply notice that thinking has become optional, and then unavailable. This is when the mind becomes disarmed, not silenced. Disarmed. It no longer has weapons, no arguments, no plans, no evaluations. Even anxiety loses its structure. Worry requires future projection. Future projection requires narrative. Without narrative, worry cannot sustain itself. This is why late at night, concerns can feel distant, not resolved, just unreachable. They still exist somewhere in memory, but the path to them has faded. The brain cannot reach forward because it has stopped organizing time. Tomorrow is no longer a clear concept. It is a vague suggestion with no urgency. This temporal softening is one of the most powerful effects of night. During the day, time presses. It pulls attention forward, deadlines, appointments, expectations. At night, time relaxes, not because hours stop passing, but because the brain stops tracking them. This loss of tracking is essential. The mind cannot rest while counting. Counting keeps it alert. So the brain lets go of sequence. Moments blend. One sensation does not clearly follow another. They overlap, drift. This drift is not confusion. It is deactivation of ordering systems. The mind is no longer constructing a timeline of experience. Without a timeline, there is no place to stand, no now compared to later, only a continuous present that does not move. This is deeply unfamiliar, And because it is unfamiliar, the waking mind often misinterprets it. It thinks something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. The brain is doing exactly what it is designed to do. It is preparing to hand control to processes that do not require awareness. This is where the distinction between mind and brain becomes clear. The mind, the narrator, the planner, the evaluator, is stepping aside. The brain, the regulator, the maintainer, the balancer, is taking over. This handoff is smooth when the mind does not interfere. When it does, sleep feels fragmented. But when the handoff completes, the experience changes qualitatively. Awareness feels heavier, not emotionally, physically. The body sinks, muscles release without instruction. Breathing becomes automatic in a way that feels different from conscious breathing. There is no monitoring, no adjustment. Breath happens without being watched. This is another sign that the mind has been disarmed. During the day, even breathing can become a task. At night, tasks disappear. Only processes remain, and processes do not speak. They do not explain themselves. They simply run. This is why the silence of deep night feels thicker than the silence before it. Earlier silence still had an observer, a sense of noticing. Now even noticing is softening. Awareness is present, but it is not sharp. It does not examine. It does not label. It rests. This resting awareness is different from the awareness you experience while awake. It does not seek information. It does not scan. It does not orient. It receives. And even that reception is passive. This is often where people feel they are slipping away, not falling, not losing control, just receding, as if consciousness itself is dimming. But dimming is not disappearance, it is redistribution. Awareness is no longer concentrated at a point. It spreads thinly across experience. And when awareness spreads too thin, it cannot maintain coherence. This is when dreams begin to solidify. Earlier, images flickered. Now they connect. They form scenes, not logically, associatively. One image leads to another because of feeling, not meaning. The brain has fully disengaged from waking reality. The external world has lost priority. Internal generation takes over, and because the mind is disarmed, there is no resistance, no checking, no questioning. This is why dreams feel convincing, not because they are vivid, but because there is no narrator to doubt them. Doubt requires distance. Distance requires identity. Identity has softened. So experience flows freely. This is the final act of nighttime disarmament. The mind no longer asks what is happening. It no longer asks who it is. It no longer asks what comes next. All of those questions belong to waking life. Night does not answer them. It removes the need for them. This removal is gentle. It does not feel like loss. It feels like permission. Permission to stop knowing, permission to stop explaining, permission to stop being someone for a while. This permission is not granted by thought. It is granted by physiology, by chemistry shifting, by systems changing priority, by repetition teaching safety. Night after night, the same lesson is learned. Letting go does not lead to harm. Silence does not erase you. The self can dissolve temporarily and reassemble without effort. This learning becomes embodied. The nervous system remembers it even when the mind forgets. And because of this, the transition into sleep becomes easier over time. Not because you master it, but because you stop interfering. The disarming of the mind is not something you do. It is something you allow by doing nothing, by not insisting.
by not pulling awareness back into performance. This is why so many sleep difficulties are not about sleep at all. They are about control, about the inability to trust that nothing needs to be managed. The mind wants to stay involved. Night asks it to step aside, and when it finally does, the system relaxes into something deeper, beyond silence, beyond awareness, toward states where even this quiet presence will fade, toward a region of the night where the brain does not register experience in any form that can be remembered, where there is no observer, no image, no sensation, just maintenance, just balance, just deep rest. But before that depth is reached, there is one last sensation many people notice, a sense of sinking into something vast, not a place, not darkness, but absence of boundary. This sensation marks the edge of the deepest transition, the point where consciousness is no longer even passive, where it releases itself completely. And beyond that edge, there is nothing to experience, nothing to remember, nothing to describe, only the brain, working quietly without the mind watching. That place, silent, unobserved, and essential, is where the night does its most important work, and it is closer now than you think. There is a belief that meditation and sleep are opposites. That one is about staying aware, and the other is about losing awareness. That meditation sharpens consciousness while sleep dissolves it. From the outside, this seems true. Meditation is practiced sitting upright, eyes closed, attention gently placed. Sleep happens lying down, eyes heavy, attention fading. One appears intentional, the other accidental. But inside the brain, the difference is not as large as it seems, because both meditation and sleep approach the same doorway. They simply walk toward it from opposite sides. To understand this, we have to look again at what actually fades at night. It is not awareness, it is effort. It is not consciousness, it is control. It is not perception, it is narration. The talking mind, the part of the system that insists on monitoring experience, evaluating it, and stitching it into a story. Meditation, at its deepest levels, does not strengthen this system. It weakens it, not by force, by irrelevance. In deep meditation, the practitioner is not trying to think better. They are allowing thought to stop being central. The same thing happens before sleep. But the path is different. Meditation approaches silence from the side of alertness. Sleep approaches silence from the side of fatigue. One says, "I will stay here, but I will stop interfering." The other says nothing at all. It simply waits until interference becomes impossible. Both lead to the same threshold, a place where awareness remains, but the voice that claims ownership of awareness steps back. This is why experienced meditators often fall asleep easily, not because meditation makes them tired, but because they have learned, at least partially, how to let go of narration. They recognize the doorway. They do not panic when language dissolves. They do not rush to reassert control. So the transition completes itself. For someone without this familiarity, the doorway can feel strange, even threatening, because the brain has learned to equate awareness with commentary. When commentary fades, the system reacts. Meditation teaches the system that nothing bad happens when commentary stops. Sleep teaches the same lesson, but without asking permission. This is why meditation and sleep are often confused. People say meditation makes them sleepy, but meditation does not cause sleep. It removes obstacles. It quiets the systems that prevent rest.
Sleep then arrives naturally. This is also why meditation can feel surprisingly difficult. It asks the mind to do something it is not trained to do, not to focus harder, not to control more precisely, but to stop justifying its own presence, to sit without explaining, to notice without naming. This feels unnatural to a system trained by society to always be legible, to always have a reason, so meditation can feel like effort, and when effort increases, narration increases. The practitioner becomes frustrated. They believe they are doing it wrong. But what they are actually encountering is the same resistance that appears before sleep, the resistance of a mind that does not yet trust silence. Sleep does not negotiate with this resistance. It waits until the mind is too tired to maintain it. Meditation asks the mind to soften willingly. This difference matters,
because it explains why meditation sometimes feels like rest and sometimes feels like struggle. When the system is ready, meditation and sleep feel almost indistinguishable. Both lead to a gentle quiet. Both reduce self-reference. Both dissolve time. But when the system is not ready, meditation feels like effort. Sleep feels elusive. The doorway is the same, but the approach is different. This doorway does not lead directly to unconsciousness. It leads first to silence, to a state where awareness exists without commentary, a state where nothing needs to be done. This is why meditation traditions often speak of resting awareness, not focusing awareness, not directing awareness, just resting. Rest implies that something has stopped working, that something has been set down. In this case, what is set down is the need to manage experience. Sleep does this automatically. Meditation does it intentionally. But the brain does not distinguish between intention and fatigue. It only recognizes signals. When narration stops being reinforced, it fades. When control stops being exercised, it weakens. When relevance disappears, language dissolves. This is the common ground between meditation and sleep, the removal of relevance. In waking life, everything feels relevant. Even trivial thoughts carry urgency. Meditation removes urgency by refusing to engage. Sleep removes urgency by removing energy. Both lead to silence. But silence is not the end point. It is the passage. Beyond silence, sleep continues toward deeper disengagement. Meditation may stop there, or it may go further. That depends on the context and the nervous system. But the doorway is the same. And once you recognize this, the fear around silence begins to change. Silence is no longer something that threatens awareness. It becomes something that supports it, a relief, a reset. This recognition often happens subtly, not as a realization, but as a shift in feeling. The next time the voice fades at night, it feels less alarming. The next time thoughts fragment, there is less resistance. The brain remembers that this path is safe. This memory is not conscious. It is stored in the nervous system, in how quickly muscles relax, in how easily breath deepens, in how little the system panics when control loosens. Meditation strengthens this memory. Sleep reinforces it. Together, they retrain the brain, not to be silent, but to not fear silence. This distinction is crucial. The brain cannot be forced into silence, but it can be taught that silence is not dangerous. Once that lesson is learned, silence appears naturally, not as an achievement, as a default state when nothing is required. This is why people who meditate regularly often report a change in their nights. They fall asleep faster, they wake less, they drift more easily. Not because they are doing something at night,
but because the system has learned during the day that letting go is safe. The doorway no longer feels unfamiliar. It feels known. This familiarity allows the transition to complete itself without interruption, without the sudden snap back into narration. Sleep deepens. Dreams become more immersive. Rest becomes more restorative. But even without meditation, the brain learns this lesson over time. Night after night, the same pattern repeats. Narration fades, silence arrives, awareness softens, sleep follows. Each repetition reinforces trust, and slowly the system becomes less reactive, less defensive, more willing to let go. This is why older adults often describe a different relationship with sleep. Not always better, but different. There is often less urgency, less resistance, less struggle. The brain has learned through repetition that the night is not a threat. That silence does not erase identity. That awareness can pause and return intact. This learning is what meditation tries to accelerate. But sleep accomplishes it regardless, one night at a time. The idea that meditation and sleep are separate practices is a product of how we think about them. From the brain's perspective, they are variations of the same process: the gradual withdrawal of narration, the surrender of control, the return to a mode of functioning that does not require explanation. This mode is not mystical, it is not spiritual, it is biological. It existed before language, before culture, before identity. It is how the brain rests, and whether you arrive there by sitting still or by lying down exhausted, the destination is the same: a quiet threshold. A pause in the story, a moment where awareness exists without needing to know itself. Sleep continues beyond this point. Meditation may linger here, but both confirm the same truth: that the brain does not need to talk to exist, that consciousness does not require narration, that silence is not the absence of mind, it is the mind without performance. And once this is seen, even faintly, the entire arc of the night takes on a different shape. Sleep is no longer an escape. Meditation is no longer a struggle. Both become expressions of the same underlying intelligence, one that knows when to speak and knows just as precisely when to stop. And as this intelligence continues its work, silence deepens further, beyond the threshold shared by meditation and sleep, toward regions where even resting awareness will dissolve, where the brain enters states that cannot be approached from the waking side at all, states that exist only when control, narration, and identity have fully stepped aside. That is where the night moves next, and it is there that the quiet becomes complete. There is a moment, usually unnoticed, when silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling like relief. Not excitement, not pleasure, relief, as if something heavy has been quietly removed without asking permission. This feeling does not come from understanding. It does not come from insight. It comes from subtraction. All day, the brain carries weight it rarely questions. Not physical weight, cognitive weight. The constant need to track, to monitor, to interpret. Every thought has a direction, every feeling demands explanation, every pause is filled before it can be felt. This effort is so familiar that it disappears into the background. You don't notice it as strain. You notice it as normal until it stops. And when it stops, the absence is unmistakable. The relief of silence is not the presence of peace. It is the absence of labor. During waking life, the mind is always doing something. Even rest is active. You try to relax. You focus on calm. You manage your stress. These are still tasks. They keep the system engaged. Silence, when it finally arrives at night, does not ask you to do anything. It removes the need to do. And that removal is what the nervous system recognizes as relief. This is why silence feels different from distraction. Distraction shifts attention. Silence dissolves the need for attention. In distraction, the mind is still busy. In silence, the mind steps aside. The body responds immediately. Breathing deepens without instruction. Muscles release without effort. The chest softens. The jaw unclenches. These changes are not reactions to calm thoughts. They happen because the thoughts have stopped demanding response. The brain no longer has to prepare for the next moment. Preparation is one of the most energy-intensive things the mind does. Anticipation, prediction, rehearsal, all of it depends on narration. When narration fades, preparation fades with it. And without preparation, the system can finally rest. This is why silence often feels like sinking into something supportive, not falling, being held. The nervous system senses that it no longer needs to stay upright, that it can stop bracing, that nothing is about to be asked of it. This sense of safety is not emotional. It is physiological. The body recognizes the absence of demand before the mind ever does. This is also why people who are chronically overstimulated often feel an intense relief when they finally reach silence. Their systems have been running hot for too long. Narration never stopped. Evaluation never paused. Silence feels like water after prolonged thirst. But for others, silence feels uncomfortable at first, not because silence is threatening, but because the system has forgotten how to recognize relief without stimulation. In such systems, activity has become the baseline. Noise feels normal. Quiet feels suspicious. So when silence arrives, the brain initially resists it. It tries to re-engage narration. It generates a thought, a worry, a question, anything to restore familiarity. This is not failure, it is habit. But if silence is allowed to linger even briefly, something shifts. The body responds first. Heart rate slows. Breathing becomes rhythmic. The sense of urgency fades, and only then does the mind begin to feel what the body already knows. That nothing is wrong, that nothing is missing, that relief does not require explanation. This order matters. Relief does not come from convincing yourself that silence is safe. It comes from letting the body experience the absence of demand. Once the body registers safety, the mind follows. This is why trying to think yourself calm rarely works. Thought is part of the system that needs rest. Silence rests it by removing it. This relief is subtle. It does not announce itself as happiness. It often appears as neutrality, a sense that things are okay without needing to be okay about anything. No satisfaction, no disappointment, just enough. This neutrality is deeply restorative because the nervous system does not require positivity. It requires balance. Silence restores balance by reducing load. It does not add pleasure, it removes pressure. This is also why silence often feels different from joy. Joy is stimulating. It activates emotion. It creates movement. Silence reduces activation. It flattens peaks. It smooths edges. It does not excite the system. It settles it. And because modern life rarely settles anything, this settling feels profound. But silence does something else as well. It removes identity from the center of experience. During the day,
Everything is filtered through a sense of self. What does this mean for me? How do I feel about this? What should I do next? These questions are constant. They are exhausting. Silence suspends them, not by answering them, by making them irrelevant. When narration stops, the self is no longer being referenced. Experience no longer revolves around a center. And without that center, the constant self-checking ends. This is an enormous relief, because self-monitoring is one of the heaviest cognitive tasks the brain performs. Even when it is subtle, even when it feels automatic, it consumes energy. Silence removes the need to monitor yourself. There is no one to evaluate, no one to defend, no one to maintain. This is why silence can feel like relief from being yourself, not in a negative way, not as rejection, as rest. The self is not destroyed, it is set down. And when it is set down, nothing collapses. The body still breathes, the brain still functions, life continues. This realization, even when it is not consciously recognized, changes something fundamental. It teaches the system that identity is not required for survival in every moment. That being does not require doing. That existence does not require narration. This teaching happens at night without effort. The brain learns it through repetition. Night after night, the same pattern unfolds. Narration fades, silence appears, relief follows. The system registers the sequence, and over time, it begins to anticipate relief instead of fearing silence. This anticipation is not cognitive, it is bodily. Muscles relax faster, breathing deepens sooner, the threshold is crossed with less resistance. This is how sleep becomes easier, not through control, but through familiarity. Silence no longer feels like absence. It feels like return. A return to a state where nothing needs to be carried, nothing needs to be managed, nothing needs to be explained. This is why people often describe the silence before sleep as comforting, not because it offers answers, because it removes questions. The brain has been questioning all day. Is this important? Is this safe? Is this acceptable? Silence ends the interrogation. And when the interrogation ends, relief follows. But relief is not the end of the process. Silence is not the destination. It is a passage. Beyond relief, the brain continues its descent. Narration is already gone. Identity is resting. But awareness is still present, and awareness, too, will eventually soften. The relief of silence is the signal that the system is ready to go further, that it trusts the process, that it is safe to release even this gentle presence. This release will not feel like relief. It will feel like nothing at all, because nothing will be felt. The system will enter a state where experience is no longer registered in a way that can be remembered. But before that depth is reached, the relief of silence serves an important role. It marks the point where resistance ends, where the brain stops asking whether it should continue, where it no longer needs reassurance. Silence answers the question without words. It says, nothing is required. And once that message is received, the final layers can dissolve. The mind no longer needs to stay nearby. Awareness no longer needs to hover. The body no longer needs to signal. The night can deepen without interruption. And in that depth, beyond relief, beyond quiet, beyond even awareness, the brain will enter the most silent state it ever reaches. A state with no sensation, no image, no self. A state that cannot be experienced from the inside, only entered. And when the system returns from that depth, hours later, the relief will be complete, not remembered,
but felt, as rest, as balance, as the quiet certainty that something essential has been restored, and that certainty will carry into the morning without explanation. Because the brain does not need words to know that silence has done its work. For some people, the moment silence deepens is not relief, it is fear, not panic in the usual sense, not a racing heart or shallow breath, but a sudden tightening, a subtle pull backward, a feeling that something essential is slipping away. This fear does not come from danger. It comes from misinterpretation. When the brain begins to lose its familiar landmarks, thought, identity, continuity, the system reacts the only way it knows how. It tries to protect what it believes is being lost, and what it believes is being lost is the self. This fear often arrives as a thought, a sharp, sudden idea. Am I disappearing? What if I don't come back? What if I lose control? These thoughts feel urgent, not because they are true, but because they reintroduce narration. They pull the mind back into structure, they restore boundaries, and in doing so, they interrupt the descent. This interruption is not weakness. It is conditioning. The brain has spent years, sometimes decades, learning that identity must be maintained. That continuity is safety. That awareness without control is a threat. So when the systems that maintain identity begin to rest, the brain misreads the signal. It thinks something is wrong. This is why the fear of disappearing is so common at night, and why it almost never appears during the day. During the day, identity is constantly reinforced. Your name, your role, your obligations. The brain has no reason to question its own existence. At night, those reinforcements vanish. There is no mirror, no conversation, no task. Identity loses its anchors, and when anchors loosen, the system reacts. This reaction can take many forms. Some people experience a sudden rush of thoughts. Others feel a physical jolt, a tightening in the chest, a reflexive movement. Others simply open their eyes. Anything to restore orientation, anything to feel solid again. This response is automatic. It is not chosen. The brain does not say, "I am afraid of disappearing." It simply moves away from the unfamiliar. But what is unfamiliar here is not danger. It is absence of reference. The self, as you experience it during the day, is not a single thing. It is a process, a loop. Thought refers to memory. Memory refers to identity. Identity refers to future. This loop keeps the system coherent. When silence interrupts the loop, coherence loosens, and loosened coherence feels like loss. But loss of what? Not life, not consciousness, loss of narration, loss of the story that says, "This is me." The fear of disappearing is the fear of story collapse, and because the story feels like you, the fear feels existential. But the story is not existence. It is a representation, a useful one, but not the foundation. Night exposes this difference. When narration fades, existence continues. Breathing continues. Heartbeat continues. Regulation continues. Nothing essential stops. Only commentary. Only self-reference. This is not obvious to the system at first. The brain has learned to rely on narration as a sign of presence. So when narration stops, it assumes presence is stopping too. This assumption is incorrect. But assumptions are not checked during transition. They are acted upon. This is why the fear feels convincing. It arrives without argument, without evidence, just urgency. And urgency brings the narrator back online. The system regains familiarity. The fear dissolves. Sleep is delayed. This cycle can repeat many times in a single night. Approach silence. Fear arises. Narration returns. Approach silence again. Fear arises again. The person experiencing this often believes they have insomnia, but what they are actually experiencing is a nervous system that has not yet learned that silence is safe. This learning does not happen through explanation. You cannot tell the brain that it is okay to disappear, because from the brain's perspective, disappearance equals death. This equation is ancient. Long before language, loss of orientation meant vulnerability, so the system reacts quickly. What changes this reaction is not reassurance, it is repetition. Night after night, the same pattern occurs. Silence approaches. Fear arises. The system returns. But occasionally, by chance, by fatigue, by exhaustion, the fear does not arrive in time. The system passes through the moment without interruption, and nothing bad happens. Breathing continues. The body remains safe. And in the morning, the self returns. This experience, even when not remembered, teaches the nervous system something, that letting go does not equal loss, that identity can pause without vanishing, that awareness can dissolve and reassemble. This teaching is slow. It does not happen in one night, but over time, the system begins to hesitate less. The fear still appears, but it is weaker, less convincing, less urgent. Eventually, it no longer arises at all, not because the person has conquered fear, but because the system has updated its assumptions. Silence no longer signals threat, it signals rest. This transition can feel dramatic when it happens. People often describe a night when they finally stopped fighting sleep. They may not know why. They may not remember what changed, but something did. The fear of disappearing lost its grip. This loss of fear does not come from courage. It comes from trust, not conscious trust, physiological trust. The nervous system has learned that the process is safe. This learning has profound effects, not just on sleep, on how the mind relates to itself. Once the brain no longer equates silence with danger, thoughts lose some of their authority. They are no longer needed to prove existence. They become optional. This changes the emotional tone of waking life. Moments of quiet feel less uncomfortable. Pauses feel less threatening. You no longer rush to fill every gap. This does not make you passive. It makes you less reactive. The fear of disappearing is closely linked to the fear of losing control. Control requires a self who controls. Silence removes the controller, and without a controller, control is impossible. This is deeply unsettling to a system trained to equate control with safety. But night teaches a different lesson, that not everything needs control, that some processes function better without oversight. Breathing is one of them. Heart rhythm is another. Sleep itself is another. These processes do not benefit from being watched. They benefit from being allowed. When the fear of disappearing dissolves, control dissolves with it, not as loss, as release. The system stops insisting on staying involved. And when involvement ends, sleep deepens. The brain moves into stages where awareness is no longer present in any recognizable form. These stages cannot be experienced, only entered, and when they are entered, the fear of disappearing becomes irrelevant, because there is no one left to be afraid. This is not a dramatic moment. There is no realization, no insight. The system simply transitions, and hours later, when awareness returns, the self is intact. Nothing has been lost. This return is crucial. It confirms the learning that disappearance was temporary, that the self is not fragile. That identity can be set down and picked up again. This confirmation strengthens trust. Night after night, the same lesson is reinforced, and slowly the fear loses its power. This is why people often say that sleep problems are not about sleep. They are about trust. Trust in the body, trust in the process, trust that letting go will not lead to harm. The fear of disappearing is the last major obstacle to deep rest. Once it dissolves, the night unfolds smoothly. Silence deepens. Awareness fades. The brain enters states where no experience is recorded. And in those states, the deepest restoration occurs. But this restoration does not depend on conquering fear. It depends on allowing fear to be outpaced by fatigue, by repetition, by biology. Night does not ask you to be brave. It waits until fear no longer has energy, until narration no longer has strength, until control no longer has relevance. Then the system passes through, and what seemed like disappearance is revealed to be something else entirely. A pause, a rest, a return to a mode of functioning that does not require a sense of self to supervise it. This realization, once embodied, changes how the night feels. Silence no longer threatens, it invites, not as escape, as care, as the brain taking responsibility for its own restoration, without asking the mind to stay involved. And as the fear recedes, another boundary becomes visible, one not marked by anxiety, but by absence, the boundary between awareness and no awareness, between presence and deep sleep. That boundary is closer now, and once it is crossed, there will be nothing left to fear, because fear itself will no longer be there, only the quiet work of the brain, continuing unseen, unfelt, and essential. That is where the night goes next. There is a stretch of the night that leaves no trace, no image, no sensation, no thought, and yet it happens every time you sleep. This is the part of the night where consciousness does not end, but memory does. Up until now, we have been moving through states that still leave impressions, fragments of images, moments of awareness, a sense of drifting or falling. These states can be remembered, at least partially, but beyond them, there is a region where nothing is recorded, not because nothing happens, because there is no system left that can store what happens. This is consciousness without memory, or more precisely, this is brain activity without the machinery of experience. During the day, consciousness and memory feel inseparable. If you're aware of something, you assume you will remember it. If you remember something, you assume you were aware. But the brain does not work that way. Awareness and memory are handled by different systems. They often cooperate, but they do not depend on each other. Night reveals this separation. As sleep deepens, the systems responsible for forming memories gradually shut down, not abruptly, layer by layer. First, working memory fades. You can no longer hold information in mind. Then, short-term encoding weakens. Events are no longer tagged for storage. Finally, even the sense of sequence disappears. There is no before and no after. Without sequence, memory has nothing to attach to. This is where experience stops being recordable. From the inside, this does not feel like darkness. It does not feel like blankness, because there is no feeling at all. But this is difficult to accept from the waking mind. We imagine this state as emptiness, as a void, as nothingness. But that is imagination speaking. From the brain's perspective, this state is full of activity. Neurons fire in coordinated patterns, chemical balances are adjusted, systems synchronize, but none of this activity is translated into experience. There is no observer, no witness, no internal narrator. So there is nothing to remember. This is why deep sleep feels like an instant. You fall asleep and suddenly you wake up. Hours have passed, but subjectively there was no time. This is not because time stopped, it is because memory did. Time only exists when it is being tracked. When tracking stops, duration disappears. This disappearance is not a flaw, it is essential. If the brain continued to form memories during its deepest maintenance phases, those processes would be disrupted. Memory formation requires attention. Attention requires energy. Energy is needed elsewhere. So the brain makes a decision. It turns memory off, not selectively, completely. This decision is one of the most important the brain makes each night because it allows the system to reset without interference. During waking life, every experience is evaluated. Is this important? Should I remember this? How does this fit with who I am? This evaluation is exhausting. Deep sleep removes evaluation entirely. Nothing is important. Nothing needs to be stored. Nothing needs to make sense. This is not loss, it is liberation. The brain is freed from the burden of experience. It no longer needs to present reality to anyone. It can work privately, quietly, efficiently. This is also why deep sleep is so restorative, not because you are unconscious, but because the system is no longer performing. Performance requires an audience. Deep sleep removes the audience. There is no one watching, so the brain can reconfigure itself without concern for coherence. Connections are pruned. Others are strengthened. Patterns are reorganized. All of this happens without awareness. And because it happens without awareness, it does not leave a story. You do not wake up remembering your brain repairing itself. You wake up feeling different, clearer, heavier, more grounded. The effects are felt, not remembered. This distinction matters because it shows that some of the most important things that happen to you do not happen to you as experience. They happen beneath experience. This challenges a deeply held assumption that awareness is required for change, that if you do not witness something, it does not count. The night proves otherwise. The deepest changes happen when no one is watching. The body heals during sleep without your awareness. The brain recalibrates without your permission. Identity softens and reforms without your involvement. You are not consulted, and you do not need to be. This can feel unsettling to the waking mind, because the waking mind likes to believe it is in charge. But night quietly contradicts this belief. It shows that control is not central, that oversight is not required, that some processes work best when consciousness is absent. This absence is not death. It is maintenance. The brain enters this state only when it is convinced that nothing external requires attention, no threats, no demands. This is why deep sleep is difficult in unsafe environments. The brain will not relinquish awareness if it believes vigilance is required. But when safety is present and when fatigue is sufficient, the system lets go completely. This letting go is not gradual. There is a boundary, not one you can feel, not one you can observe, but one that exists. On one side, there is still some trace of experience. On the other, there is none. Once that boundary is crossed, there is no awareness of crossing it, no sensation of falling asleep, no fading to black, because there is no one left to experience fading. This is the true disappearance people fear. But it is not frightening, because fear requires awareness, and awareness is gone. There is no panic, no resistance, no sense of loss, just absence of experience. From the outside, this state is called deep sleep. From the inside, it cannot be described. There is no inside, and yet this state is not empty. It is full of structured activity. Slow waves sweep across the cortex. Large populations of neurons synchronize their firing. This synchronization is thought to be essential for restoring balance. It is as if the brain returns to a basic rhythm, a rhythm that predates experience, predates memory, predates identity. In this rhythm, the brain is not processing information. It is stabilizing itself, returning to baseline. This baseline is not neutral. It is active, but it is not representational. Nothing stands for anything else. There are no symbols, no meanings, just coordinated motion. This is the deepest rest the brain knows, and it can only happen when experience is absent, when memory is off, when awareness is gone. This is why dreams stop here. Dreams require some form of awareness, some form of internal world. Deep sleep has no world. It has no scenes, no characters, no time, just regulation. This also explains something curious. People often believe that if they dream all night, they have slept poorly. And if they remember nothing, they have slept well. This belief is not entirely wrong. Memory of dreams means awareness was present. Absence of memory often means deeper sleep occurred. Not because dreams are bad, but because deep sleep does not produce experience. It produces restoration. The body and brain require both. But deep sleep is irreplaceable, and deep sleep requires the complete suspension of experience. This suspension is what the waking mind calls disappearance. But it is not disappearance of the organism. It is disappearance of the observer. And the observer is not the same thing as the brain. Night teaches this lesson without explanation. It demonstrates that you can be gone and still be alive, that the self can vanish and nothing collapses, that existence does not depend on being experienced. This is a profound truth, but it is not meant to be understood. It is meant to be lived through repeatedly, until the nervous system no longer resists it, until the fear of disappearance loses relevance, until the system trusts that absence is safe. This trust is what allows deep sleep to happen easily, without struggle, without interruption. When this trust is present, the transition into deep sleep feels effortless. You do not notice falling asleep. You simply stop being there, and then, hours later, you are back, with no memory of where you went. This return is as mysterious as the disappearance. Awareness reappears. Memory turns back on. Identity reforms. The story resumes. You wake up. And the gap between sleeping and waking is seamless. No sense of loss. No sense of interruption. Just continuity. This seamlessness is what reassures the system. It proves that nothing essential was lost, that the pause was temporary, that the self can be suspended and restored. This proof is not logical, it is experiential. The nervous system feels it in the morning, as rest, as clarity, as balance. And because this proof is repeated night after night, the system gradually learns. It learns that deep absence is not a threat. It is necessary, it is beneficial, it is part of the cycle. This learning does not make sleep perfect, but it makes surrender possible. It allows the system to cross the boundary without panic, without resistance. into the part of the night where nothing is experienced and everything is repaired. And once that repair is complete, the system will begin its return journey, not abruptly, gradually. Awareness will flicker back on, dreams may reappear, images may form, memory will resume, and the self will reassemble itself without effort. But that return is another transition entirely, one that moves from absence back into presence, from silence back into sound, from nothing back into something. That journey is already underway long before you wake up, and it is the final movement of the night, one we have not yet followed, but we are getting closer, because once you understand what it means for consciousness to disappear without harm, the return of consciousness takes on a different meaning, not as resurrection, but as reconfiguration. That is where the night leads next. The return does not begin with waking. It begins long before you ever open your eyes. Somewhere deep in the night, after the brain has spent time in that memoryless, experience-free state, something shifts again, not dramatically, not consciously. There is no moment that says, now consciousness is coming back, but the direction changes. The brain has finished its deepest work. Balances have been restored. Systems have synchronized. The need for total absence has passed. And so, without announcing it, the brain begins to reassemble experience. This reassembly does not start with thought. It starts with rhythm. Electrical patterns change. Slow sweeping waves give way to more complex activity. The brain does not jump from nothing to full awareness. It builds upward, layer by layer. At first, there is still no memory, no sense of self, no narrative. But something subtle returns. Variability. The brain becomes less uniform. Different regions begin to speak again, not in words, but in patterns. This is the earliest hint of return. From the inside, there is still nothing to experience, but the conditions for experience are quietly forming. Dreaming often appears here, not the vivid dreams you remember, but faint, unstable ones, fragments, scenes without clarity, emotions without story. These are not messages, they are scaffolding. The brain is testing its ability to generate experience again without fully committing to it. This is why dreams near morning feel different from dreams earlier in the night. They are lighter, more narrative, closer to waking logic, but still not anchored, still not owned, still not remembered clearly. Awareness is beginning to flicker, but it has not yet claimed a position. There is still no me, just experience assembling itself without a center. This is important, because the self does not return first. The world returns first. Sensations, images, motion. Only later does the sense of someone experiencing them snap back into place. This order is not accidental. It reveals something fundamental. The self is not the foundation of experience. It is an overlay, a useful one, but not the base layer. Night dismantles this overlay completely. Morning rebuilds it, and the rebuilding happens so smoothly that it feels instantaneous. But it is not. It is gradual, and if you wake up at just the right moment, you can feel it happening. That strange foggy state where you are awake but not fully yourself. You know where you are but not why. You recognize the room, but identity feels soft. Thoughts arrive slowly. Memory is incomplete. This is the self rebooting. Not all at once, in pieces. You may not remember what day it is immediately. You may not remember what you were worried about yesterday. Those concerns have not returned yet. They are not fundamental. They are reloaded later. First comes orientation. Where am I? Then continuity. What was happening before? Then identity. Who am I supposed to be today? This sequence happens every morning, so reliably that you never question it. But it is extraordinary because it shows that identity is not stored as a solid thing. It is reconstructed.
Each day, from memory, from context, from expectation, night removes it completely. Morning rebuilds it without effort. You do not choose your identity in the morning. It arrives, fully formed, with preferences, with habits, with concerns. The brain does not ask whether you want it back. It assumes you do. And because it returns so seamlessly, the gap in between is forgotten. You do not wake up thinking, I was gone. You wake up thinking, I slept. The language hides the truth. You did not experience sleep. You were absent from it. And yet you returned unchanged. This is the quiet miracle of every morning. The return from nothing without loss, without damage, without interruption. The brain proves every day that absence is survivable. That the self can disappear and come back intact. This proof is not intellectual. It is embodied. The nervous system feels it, which is why over time, the fear of disappearance weakens. The system has too much evidence that nothing bad happens. Night after night, the same cycle repeats. The self dissolves, experience disappears. The brain works unseen. Then experience reappears. The self reforms. Life continues. This repetition teaches trust. Not the kind of trust you think about, the kind you live in. You trust gravity not because you understand it, but because it has never failed you. The nervous system trusts sleep for the same reason. Eventually, this trust does not mean you never have restless nights. It means the system knows, at a deep level, that letting go is not fatal, that awareness can pause, that memory can shut down, that identity can vanish and return. The return also explains why mornings feel the way they do, the heaviness, the slowness, the reluctance to think. This is not laziness. It is reconstruction. The brain is bringing systems back online. Narration is one of the last to return. This is why the first moments of waking can feel strangely quiet. Before the day's story resumes, before worries reattach, before the inner voice fully claims the space, there is often a brief calm, a softness, a few seconds where you exist without explanation. This moment is the mirror of the silence before sleep. On one side of the night, narration fades. On the other, it returns. And in between, there is nothing. This symmetry is rarely noticed because mornings are rushed. The day demands performance. The narrator is summoned quickly, but if you ever wake slowly, without urgency, you may notice it, that the voice is not there yet, that identity feels loose, that awareness exists without commentary, just as it did before you fell asleep. This moment is fragile. It disappears as soon as the day reasserts itself. But it reveals something profound. That silence is not exclusive to night. It is simply crowded out during the day. The brain does not permanently lose its capacity for quiet. It just deprioritizes it. Morning shows that the return of the self is optional for a brief window. You can exist without immediately becoming someone. But the world rarely allows that. So narration returns, plans form, concerns attach, the day begins, and the cycle continues. The importance of this return cannot be overstated. It completes the lesson of the night, not just that you can disappear safely, but that you can come back
effortlessly. The system does not struggle to rebuild identity. It does not search for it. It reconstructs it automatically. This means the self is not a fragile possession. It is a pattern the brain knows how to generate, which means you do not need to guard it so tightly at night. You do not need to protect it from silence. It will be there in the morning. This realization, even when it is never thought explicitly, changes how the nervous system behaves. It relaxes its grip. It resists less. It allows the night to do its work. The fear of not waking up is often really the fear of not coming back as yourself. But the brain has already answered that fear thousands of times. You wake up. You remember who you are. You continue, night after night. This reliability is the foundation of trust. And trust is what allows the deepest sleep to occur. The return from nothing is not a resurrection. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing needed saving. It is simply a reconfiguration. The brain switching modes from maintenance back to interaction, from internal balance back to external engagement. This switch is smooth because the brain practices it daily. It is one of the most rehearsed transitions you will ever make. And because it is so well rehearsed, it feels ordinary. But it is not. It is extraordinary that consciousness can disappear completely and reappear without effort. That identity can dissolve and reform intact. That experience can pause and resume seamlessly. This is not something most systems can do, but the brain does it every night, quietly, reliably, without asking permission. Understanding this does not require analysis or belief. It only requires noticing how often it has already happened. Every morning you have ever woken up is evidence, and as this evidence accumulates, the nervous system learns. That night is not an enemy. That silence is not a threat. That absence is part of the cycle. This learning prepares the system for the final phase of the night, not the return, but the approach to return. The stage where awareness begins to hover again, where dreams become more vivid, where the brain tests readiness for waking. This stage has its own character, its own sensations, its own strange logic, and it is there, in those last hours before morning, that the night begins to loosen its grip. Not abruptly, not cleanly, but gently, as if the system were stretching after deep rest. And that gentle stretching, that gradual re-entry into experience, is the final movement of the night, one that completes the arc from silence back into sound, from absence back into presence. And that is where we will go next. When awareness begins to return, it does not arrive all at once. It seeps in, softly, unevenly. The night loosens its hold in a way that is almost considerate, as if the brain knows that a sudden return would be too sharp. So it prepares the system, not with thoughts, not with clarity, with atmosphere. Dreams become lighter, less immersive, more narrative. Scenes hold together longer. Time begins to behave again. You might still be dreaming, but the dream has structure now. A beginning, a middle, sometimes even an ending. This is not accidental. The brain is testing continuity. It is asking, quietly, can we tell a story again? Earlier in the night, stories were unnecessary. The brain needed silence, absence, no audience. Now the need has shifted. The systems responsible for interaction are warming back up. Language centers regain activity. Memory systems begin to reconnect. The mind is not awake yet, but it is no longer absent. This in-between return has a distinct quality. You may recognize it when you wake briefly during the night or early in the morning. A sense of being almost someone, not fully oriented, not fully engaged. Thoughts are slow, but they exist. Identity is present, but it is loose. This looseness is important. It allows something from the night to come back with you, something that usually gets lost once the day asserts itself. The residue of silence. Silence does not disappear when awareness returns. It lingers, not as emptiness, as spaciousness. The mind can think again, but it does not rush. Thoughts have more room between them. They do not collide as quickly. They do not demand immediate response. This is the silence that stays with you, not the silence of absence,
but the silence of reduced urgency. It is subtle, so subtle that most people miss it, but it shapes the first moments of the day. The way light enters the room, the way the body stretches, the way breath feels before the first thought fully claims attention. In these moments, you are not yet performing. You are not yet narrating. You are simply present. And because presence returned gently, it carries something with it. A memory without content. A calm without cause. This is not something you remember consciously. It is something the nervous system retains. The night has done its work, and the system knows it. This lingering silence is one of the most important effects of sleep because it influences how the day begins. If the return is rushed, if an alarm pulls you abruptly into identity, the residue is lost. Narration snaps back online too quickly. Urgency returns. The silence evaporates. But when the return is gradual, when the brain is allowed to reassemble itself at its own pace, something different happens. The silence stretches. It accompanies you into waking life, not as stillness, as steadiness. This steadiness is often mistaken for mood. People say they woke up calm, but calm is not an emotion. It is the absence of reactivity. The nervous system is balanced. Thoughts arise, but they do not overwhelm. Emotions appear, but they do not escalate. This does not mean the day will be easy. It means the system is not already overloaded. The silence has given it margin. This margin is precious because waking life is demanding. It pulls attention outward. It asks questions. It requires decisions. Without margin, every demand feels heavy. With margin, demands are manageable. Silence creates margin by reducing baseline noise. This is why a good night's sleep changes everything without changing anything. The world is the same. Your responsibilities are the same. But your relationship to them is different. The silence has not solved problems. It has reduced interference. This reduction allows the mind to function more efficiently. Thoughts are clearer. Reactions are slower. Choices feel less urgent. This effect is not mystical. It is mechanical. The brain has reset itself. The systems that monitor threat are less active. The systems that regulate emotion are balanced. The system that narrates identity has not yet fully tightened its grip. So the day begins in a softer configuration. This configuration does not last forever. As the day progresses, noise accumulates, interaction increases, narration ramps up. But the residue of silence can persist longer than you think, especially if the morning is gentle, if you do not immediately flood the system with information, if you allow the brain to remain in this quieter mode for a little while longer. This is why many people cherish early mornings, not because they are productive, but because the world is quiet and the mind has not yet filled itself. The silence from the night has not been overwritten. In these moments, awareness feels wider, less focused on self, less crowded by story.
This is not the silence of sleep. It is the silence of integration. The brain is transitioning from internal maintenance to external engagement. And during this transition, it carries forward some of the night's configuration. This carryover is not guaranteed. It depends on how the transition happens. Abrupt waking disrupts it. Stress erases it. Immediate stimulation overwrites it. But gentle waking preserves it. Not because you try to preserve it, but because you do not rush to replace it. This reveals something subtle about silence. Silence is not a state that belongs only to the night. It is a capacity, a mode, one that the brain can access when conditions allow. Night creates those conditions automatically. Morning can briefly sustain them. Daytime can sometimes rediscover them, but only when demand drops. This is why moments of silence can appear unexpectedly during the day. While walking, while staring out a window, while listening without trying to respond. These moments are not accidents. They are echoes of the night. The brain remembers what it feels like to not be under pressure, and when pressure eases, even briefly, it returns to that configuration. This return is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it feels like space, like breathing room, like the sense that you're not being chased by your own thoughts. This is the silence that stays with you, not as emptiness, as freedom from urgency. It does not mean the mind stops working. It means the mind stops pushing. This distinction matters because many people chase silence as if it were stillness, as if thoughts must disappear. But the silence that integrates into waking life does not require that. Thoughts can exist. They just do not dominate. They do not speak over everything else. They take turns. They leave gaps. Those gaps are where choice exists. Without silence, reaction is automatic. With silence, response becomes possible. This is one of the most practical effects of the night. It does not make you wiser. It makes you less reactive. This reduction in reactivity has cascading effects. Emotion regulation improves. Decision-making stabilizes. Perspective widens. Not because you gained insight, because the noise floor dropped. Silence lowered the baseline. Everything else feels different in relation to it. This is why chronic lack of sleep is so destabilizing, not just because of fatigue, but because silence never arrives. The system never resets. Noise accumulates. Reactivity increases. The mind becomes brittle. Every stimulus feels sharp. Every thought feels urgent. Without silence, there is no buffer, no margin, no space to absorb experience. This is why the silence of the night is not optional. It is not a luxury. It is maintenance. And the silence that stays with you is proof that maintenance has occurred. You may not notice it consciously, but your body does. Your nervous system does. It carries that balance forward into the day, even if the day later erodes it. The system remembers what balance feels like, and this memory influences how quickly balance can be restored. Over time, this matters. Night after night, the system is reminded of a quieter mode, and each reminder makes that mode more accessible, not just at night, but in moments of rest during the day. This does not require practice. It requires permission. Permission for silence to exist without being filled. Most of the time, we deny that permission. We fill gaps automatically. We distract ourselves. We stay busy. But silence does not demand effort. It demands restraint, the restraint to not immediately replace it. The silence that stays with you is fragile. It disappears easily, but it is also resilient. It returns every night.
No matter how loud the day has been, no matter how full the mind feels, night strips the system down again, removes the excess, resets the baseline, and then sends you back with a little more space. This cycle is not dramatic. It is quiet, but it shapes everything. It shapes how you respond to stress, how you relate to thought, how you inhabit your own awareness. When silence becomes familiar, thought loses its monopoly. It becomes one voice among others, not the authority, not the center. This familiarity does not make you detached. It makes you flexible. You can think when thinking is needed, and let go when it is not. The silence of the night teaches this flexibility without instruction. It does not explain itself. It demonstrates, night after night.
And the silence that stays with you is the demonstration's after image, a reminder carried into waking life that you do not need to be loud inside to exist, that awareness does not depend on narration, that you can move through the day without constantly explaining yourself to yourself. This reminder is easy to lose, but it is impossible to eliminate, because the night will return, and with it, silence will do its work again, preparing the system to carry a little more space into the next day, and the next, and over time, this accumulation changes something fundamental, the relationship between you and your thoughts. They become less sticky, less urgent, less defining, and in that shift, a new question quietly emerges, not asked by thought, not framed by language, but felt. If silence can follow you into waking life, even briefly, what else might it change? And how much of who you think you are depends on the noise that silence quietly removes. That question does not need answering. It only needs to be noticed, because noticing it creates a pause. And in that pause, the silence that stayed with you has room to breathe. And as the day continues, that silence will gradually thin. Narration will return. Urgency will rise. The world will pull. But tonight, the cycle will repeat. Silence will return, deeper, quieter, and it will leave its mark again, not as memory, as balance. And that balance will carry you forward into the final movement of the night, the one that does not happen in sleep, but in how the night reshapes the way the mind learns to be awake. By the time the day is fully awake, the silence has almost vanished, not dramatically, not all at once. It thins, it becomes background. Thoughts return to their usual speed. Identity tightens its shape. Urgency rebuilds itself piece by piece. And yet, something remains altered, not obvious enough to name, not strong enough to hold on to, but present. This is the quiet influence of the night. It does not announce itself as calm or clarity. It shows up in what doesn't happen, a reaction that doesn't escalate, a thought that doesn't spiral, a pause that appears where there used to be none. Most people never notice this. They attribute it to mood, or personality, or luck. But it is something else. It is the nervous system remembering silence, not as an experience, but as a reference point. The brain now knows, at a level below thought, that another mode exists, a mode where narration is optional, where identity can soften, where urgency is not constant. This knowledge does not arrive as an idea. It arrives as flexibility. During the day, the mind is pulled in many directions. Decisions must be made. Responses must be formed. Roles must be played. Narration becomes necessary again, but it no longer needs to be absolute, because the system has learned that narration can stop, and that when it stops, nothing breaks.
This learning is subtle, but it accumulates. Each night reinforces it. Each return from silence leaves behind a faint trace. Over time, these traces overlap. And something changes in how the mind relates to itself. Thoughts become less convincing, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer the only signal. Silence has entered the conversation, not loudly, quietly, as an alternative. This is why some thoughts lose their urgency over time, not because they were solved, but because the system learned they are not required for survival. During the night, the brain survives without them. It regulates without commentary. It exists without explanation. This realization weakens the authority of thought, not through argument, through evidence. Night after night, the same evidence is presented. You stop thinking, you disappear from experience, and you return intact. This repetition changes the weighting the brain assigns to mental activity. Thought is no longer treated as essential for continuity. It becomes useful, but not sacred. This shift does not make you passive. It makes you selective. You do not respond to every thought. You do not identify with every narrative. Some thoughts pass through without leaving residue. This was not possible before silence became familiar. Before, every thought felt like a signal. Now, some thoughts feel like noise, not ignored, just not amplified. This is the lasting effect of mental silence. It does not erase thinking. It contextualizes it. It gives the system a sense of scale. Thoughts are no longer the whole field. They are events within it. This awareness does not require constant reinforcement. It does not need practice. It does not need belief. It is refreshed every night. Silence returns, the system resets, and the reference point is renewed. This is why periods of good sleep often lead to changes in perspective. People say things like, "I just don't care as much anymore," or "Things don't get to me the same way." This is often misunderstood as emotional detachment. But it is not detachment, it is proportionality. When silence has been experienced, even unconsciously, the mind knows there is more space than whatever is happening now. This space does not negate emotion. It contains it. Emotion still arises, but it does not fill the entire system. There is room around it. That room comes from silence. From the knowledge, felt, not thought, that experience can exist without narration. This changes how stress behaves. Stress thrives on urgency, on the sense that something must be resolved right now. Silence undermines urgency. It introduces the possibility that not everything requires immediate response, because the night responds to nothing and still functions perfectly. This is not logic, it is conditioning. The brain has been conditioned to tolerate gaps, to survive pauses, to endure absence. This tolerance carries into waking life. Pauses become possible. Silence becomes less threatening. This is why some people find themselves less compulsive after periods of deep rest. They do not need to fill every moment. They do not need to narrate constantly. They can sit with experience without immediately labeling it. This capacity is not learned through instruction. It is learned through absence, through the nightly disappearance of the observer, through the nightly suspension of identity, through the brain's direct experience of functioning without commentary. This learning does not stay in sleep. It reshapes wakefulness, subtly, gradually, almost invisibly, but its effects accumulate over weeks, months, years. People often describe this change as maturity, or wisdom, or calm. But these words miss the mechanism. What has changed is not personality.
It is baseline noise. The system has learned to operate with less internal interference. This does not mean life becomes easier. It means life becomes quieter inside, which is not the same thing. Challenges still exist, decisions still matter, pain still arises, but the mind is not fighting itself at the same time. Silence has reduced internal conflict by revealing that narration is not mandatory. This reduction of conflict has profound consequences. It frees energy. Energy that was previously spent monitoring, evaluating, and defending can be redirected toward attention, toward perception, toward engagement, not frantic engagement, present engagement. This is why people who sleep well often feel more alive, not because they have more thoughts, because they have fewer unnecessary ones. Silence has trimmed the excess, not permanently, but repeatedly, enough to make a difference. The most important aspect of this lingering silence is that it does not depend on memory. You do not have to remember being silent. The system remembers for you in how quickly it settles, in how slowly it reacts, in how easily it lets go. This is why trying to recreate silence during the day often fails. The silence that matters is not produced by effort. It is produced by trust, and trust is built through repetition. Night provides that repetition, relentlessly, even when sleep feels poor, even when dreams are vivid, even when you wake up tired. Some degree of silence still occurs. Some degree of absence still resets the system. This is why even imperfect sleep has value, because some part of the cycle still completes. The brain still steps out of narration for a while. And that step out is enough to remind the system that another mode exists. This reminder weakens the illusion that the mind must always be busy. It creates the possibility of rest within activity, of space within thought, of silence within sound. This is the silence that stays with you, not as a state, as a capability, the capability to pause, to not immediately respond, to let thoughts arise and fall without chasing them. This capability is not dramatic. It does not transform your life overnight, but it changes the texture of being alive. It introduces softness where there was rigidity, flexibility where there was compulsion. This softness is not weakness. It is resilience. A system that does not overreact lasts longer, recovers faster. This is the true gift of the night, not insight, not revelation, regulation. The brain regulating itself through silence, and then carrying that regulation forward into the day. Most of the time, this happens without your awareness, which is exactly how it should happen. The brain does not require your supervision. It has been doing this long before you were able to think about it. Silence is not something you need to manage. It is something the brain knows how to create, given the right conditions. Night provides those conditions every night, again and again, and because the cycle repeats, the effects compound, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize something has changed, not because you decided it should, but because the noise no longer has the same power. The voice in your head still speaks, but it is no longer alone. There is space around it, and in that space, something new becomes possible. A different relationship with thought, with identity, with experience itself. This is not enlightenment. It is not transcendence. It is familiarity with silence, and familiarity removes fear. Once silence is familiar, it no longer feels like loss. It feels like background, like gravity, always there, not demanding attention, but shaping everything. And when silence reaches this point, when it is no longer something that comes and goes, but something the system recognizes, the night prepares for its final gesture. Not another disappearance, but a confirmation. A quiet statement made without words that the brain will stop talking again tonight. No matter how loud the day has been, no matter how busy the mind feels now, no matter how convinced you are that thinking is unavoidable, the brain knows otherwise, and it will prove it. One more time, without asking, without explaining, just by doing what it has always done. And that certainty, that silence will return, is where the story moves next, not to an ending, but to a continuation, because the night never finishes its work. It only pauses until the next time the brain remembers how to stop talking again. Tonight, the brain will stop talking again, not because you ask it to, not because you understand how. It will stop because stopping is part of its nature. All day, it has been gathering noise, words, images, reactions, expectations. It has carried them faithfully. It has tried to make sense of them, to connect them, to protect you through them. But the brain was never meant to speak continuously. Language is a tool, not a habitat. And when night arrives, the conditions that require speech begin to dissolve. The lights dim, the world slows, the social field collapses. Nothing needs to be explained. Nothing needs to be defended. The brain recognizes this shift before you do. It always has. This recognition does not happen in thought. It happens in chemistry. Signals change. Systems that were prioritized all day begin to lose influence. Narration weakens. Urgency loosens its grip. The voice that has been commenting, planning, correcting, and predicting starts to thin, not abruptly, gently, like a muscle that has been holding tension for too long and finally releases. This release does not feel dramatic. Most of the time, you barely notice it. A thought trails off. A sentence never finishes. An image fades before it forms meaning. And in the spaces between those moments, silence appears, not as emptiness, as permission. Permission for the brain to stop proving its existence. Permission to stop explaining why you're here, who you are, and what comes next. These questions are not answered. They are abandoned. And in their absence, something remarkable happens. The brain does not collapse. It does not drift into chaos. It becomes more precise, more efficient. Freed from narration, it returns to regulation. Breathing deepens, heart rhythm steadies, energy redistributes to places that need it. The body is repaired. Connections are adjusted. Patterns are synchronized. All of this happens without awareness, because awareness would interfere. The talking mind would want to watch, to interpret, to judge progress. So the brain removes the watcher, not permanently, just long enough. This removal is not a failure of consciousness. It is a feature. Consciousness is expensive. It consumes resources. It demands coherence. Deep restoration requires privacy, and night provides it. Every night, even when sleep feels restless, even when dreams are vivid, even when you wake up believing you did not rest. Somewhere beneath that experience, the brain still stopped talking for minutes, sometimes longer, long enough to remind the system that silence is possible, that silence is safe, that silence is necessary. This reminder does not arrive as a message. It arrives as balance. You feel it the next day in subtle ways, in the way a thought loses momentum, in the way a pause feels tolerable, in the way you do not react as quickly as you once did. These changes are not dramatic. They are cumulative. The brain learns through repetition. Night after night, it practices stopping, and each time it stops, it weakens the belief that talking is mandatory. That belief, that the mind must always be active, is one of the most deeply ingrained assumptions of modern life. But the brain does not share it. The brain knows that constant narration is unsustainable, so it interrupts it reliably without consulting you. This interruption is not rebellion. It is care. Care for a system that cannot maintain coherence without rest. Care for a nervous system that needs silence as much as it needs oxygen. And because this care is automatic, you do not have to earn it. You do not have to be calm enough. You do not have to understand enough. You do not have to let go correctly. Fatigue will do the work. Darkness will do the work. Time will do the work. The brain does not wait for your permission to rest itself. It only waits for the right conditions. Those conditions are arriving again, even now. As the day stretches toward night, the same cycle prepares to repeat. The mind may resist. It may insist that something needs to be solved, that something must be finished, that tomorrow depends on continued thinking. The brain listens, and then, when the moment is right, it stops listening. Thoughts lose clarity, control loosens, awareness softens, and once again, the talking mind steps aside. What remains is not nothing. It is the brain functioning without commentary, doing what it has always done best. This stopping is not an ending. It is not a shutdown. It is a return to a deeper rhythm, one that does not require words, one that existed before language ever learned to describe itself. Tonight, you will not notice the exact moment the brain stops talking. There will be no signal, no announcement. Because silence does not need to be declared. It simply happens when nothing interrupts it. And once it happens, everything else becomes unnecessary. Experience pauses, memory releases, identity dissolves, and the brain works unseen. Hours later, you will return. You will wake up believing nothing happened, but something did. The brain remembered how to be quiet, and that remembering will shape you long after the night has passed, not as an insight, not as a lesson, as a baseline, as the quiet knowledge that thought is optional, that silence is not absence, that stopping is part of being alive, and when night comes again, the brain will demonstrate this truth once more, without effort, without explanation, without asking you to understand. Just by doing what it has always done when the world finally becomes quiet enough. And as that quiet approaches, the only thing left to notice is not what will happen, but how little needs to happen for the mind to finally let itself be still.